Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere warm, somewhere the morning light comes in through tall windows and falls across pale stone floors that have been swept since before sunrise, where the smell of the kitchen courtyard rises up the stairwells in the long Tuscan summer, where the silver in the dining room is being polished by a girl who has been polishing it since she was 12, where a tapestry the size of a small wall has just been brought down from the loggia and is being aired in the sun before it goes back into storage for another season. We are going to Florence. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. We are going to one particular building in Florence. We are going to the building that for almost 300 years was the most photographed, the most painted, the most discussed, and the most quietly powerful private house in all of Italy. Understand? But adaptable to anointing up and the gold. We are going to the Palazzo Medici. We are going to the family who built it. And we are going to spend tonight, the long, slow tonight that this story requires, walking through the rooms and the gardens and the lives of the wealthiest family in Renaissance Florence, the family whose name became, in its own century, a synonym for money and culture and patronage, the family that produced 2 popes and 2 queens of France, and a long line of grand dukes, the family that put Botticelli at the dinner table and Michelangelo in the spare bedroom, and Donatello in the courtyard, and that walked every morning of every year for 200 years past works of art that the modern world now visits on guided tours and considers itself fortunate to have seen. Before we go anywhere, I want you to hold a particular image in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. A morning in the Palazzo Medici. The year is 1469. It is not yet 6 o'clock. The summer light is just beginning to come up over the bell tower of San Lorenzo, 3 streets away, where the family chapel holds the bones of the older generation, and where the sound of the matin bells is, in a few minutes, going to start the day for half the city. In the kitchen courtyard at the back of the palazzo, a woman in her 30s, in a plain wool dress with the sleeves pushed back to the elbow, is laying the morning fire under the great brick range that runs along one wall of the kitchen. Her name is Lucrezia. She is not the Lucrezia of the family. She is one of the kitchen women, hired from a village in the hills 3 years ago by the head steward, and she has been laying this fire every morning of every day she has been in the household, except for the days when the family is at the country villa at Careggi, in which case she goes with them and lays a different fire in a different kitchen. She has the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times. She lays the kindling. She strikes the flint. She blows gently on the small flame that catches. She feeds the larger sticks in. She hangs the great copper kettle on the chain above it. She steps back and pulls the front of her apron straight. She goes to the door of the kitchen and looks out into the courtyard, where the first carts of the morning are arriving with the bread and the fish and the early vegetables from the markets at the Mercato Vecchio, and she waves a hand at the boy who has come with the bread and tells him to bring it round to the side entrance. She goes back to her fire. She puts a second copper pot on the iron tripod beside it. She measures water from the pail at the door. She pours. This is the Palazzo Medici on a working morning in the year 1469. This is the part of the house that the painters of the period did not paint. The painters painted the great hall with its frescoes and the chapel with the procession of the Magi running around 3 of its walls. The painters painted Lorenzo de Medici, who is at this hour asleep on the upper floor of the building in a bed with hangings of Florentine silk, and they painted his wife, Clarice Orsini, who is also asleep, in a separate bedchamber at the other end of the gallery, and they painted his mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who at this hour is awake, but has not yet rung the bell for her women, and who is sitting up against the bolster of her own bed reading a small book of devotional poetry that she herself, in another part of her life, has been writing. They did not paint the kitchen woman, whose name is also Lucrezia, who is laying the fire that will in due course cook the food course, be served to the family upstairs. But the kitchen woman is the part of the house that we are going to begin with, because the house only worked because she was in it, and the family only existed in the form we now remember because the kitchen woman and 40 other women and men of her kind were in it with her. The Medici, in 1469, are at the height of their power. They are not, technically, the rulers of Florence. The Florentine Republic is a republic. It has a constitution. It has elected officials. It has councils that vote on legislation. The Medici hold no formal title. They are, in the technical language of the city, simply private citizens. But the technical language in 1469 has become a polite fiction that everyone in Florence has been participating in for most of a generation. The Medici, through the careful cultivation of clients, allies, and creditors, through the management of the marriages of their daughters, through the placing of their sons in offices, through the slow, patient accumulation of what amounts, in practical terms, to a private political machine, have made themselves the de facto rulers of the city. Lorenzo, who is 20 years old in 1469, is in the process of taking over from his father Piero, who is dying of gout in a bedchamber on the floor below. Within months, Piero will be dead. Lorenzo will assume the position. He will hold it for 23 years. The years he holds it will, in due course, be remembered as the high noon of the Florentine Renaissance, the period in which the city produced more great art per square foot than any other city in Europe has ever produced before or since, and in which the family at the centre of it all lived. For a brief few decades, the kind of life that the rest of Italy could only watch from a distance and try, with varying degrees of success, to imitate. This is the Florence we are going to. We are going to follow them for nearly 300 years, from the careful banker who founded the family fortune in the late 14th century to the last Medici who died, an old woman alone in the same palazzo in 1743, having outlived every other member of her line and having signed in her old age the document that left the entire accumulated collection of the family, the paintings and the sculptures and the manuscripts and the gardens, to the city of Florence on the condition that it never leave. She kept her word. The family ended. The collection stayed, and the rooms we are going to walk through tonight, the rooms that the kitchen woman is laying her fire in this morning of 1469, are still, in 2026, more or less where they were, and the paintings that hung on the walls when Lorenzo de Medici walked past them on his way to dinner are still, in many cases, hanging in the same rooms or in the rooms of the museum across the river that the same family eventually built and housed them. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, whether you are here to drift into sleep over the long, slow story of a family that mattered for almost 3 centuries, or whether you have come for the silks and the banquets and the gardens and the marble courtyards. I am glad you are with me. If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did. There are more long stories to come. Now, let us begin where the family began, which is in the city of Florence, at the end of the 14th century, in a wool merchant's house on a small street in the quarter of San Lorenzo, in a household whose ambitions were modest, whose name was not yet famous, and whose head, at the moment our story opens, was a young man called Giovanni di Bicci de Medici, who was about to make a series of careful decisions that would, over the next 40 years, lift his family from comfortable obscurity into a position from which they would, within 2 generations, effectively control one of the great cities of Europe. To understand the Medici, we have to understand Florence. Florence in 1400 was not the largest city in Italy. Venice was larger. Naples was larger. Milan was larger. Florence was, by some accounts, the 4th largest of the Italian cities of the period, with a population of perhaps 50 or 60,000, down sharply from the 120,000 it had held before the Black Death of 1348 had carried off something close to half of its population in 18 months. Florence had recovered from the plague. It had not in 1400 recovered to its previous size, and it would not in fact reach its pre-plague population again for centuries. But what Florence had in 1400 was something more important than size. It had wool, it had silk, it had the largest concentration of cloth finishing workshops in Europe. It had a network of merchants who had, over the previous century, established themselves as the suppliers of finished cloth to the courts and cathedrals and wealthy households of half the continent. And it had banks. It had a great many banks. The bankers of Florence had by 1400 made themselves the principal financial intermediaries of the Western Mediterranean. The men through whom the kings of France and England, and the popes of Avignon and Rome, and the merchants of Bruges and London and Lyon and Geneva conducted their business. The wool was the foundation, the cloth was the wealth, the banking was the consequence. And the city that had been built on these three things had become, by the early 15th century, one of the most genuinely interesting urban communities in Europe. The city was a republic. This is the part that the casual modern observer can miss, because the modern observer has heard so much about the Medici and the popes and the dukes and the courts that the underlying political form sometimes drops out of the picture. Florence in 1400 had been a republic for 2 centuries. It had a constitution, it had elected officials, it had councils. It had, above all, a system of guilds, the great corporations of artisans and merchants who controlled between them the political life of the city. There were 7 major guilds, the Arti Maggiori, and 14 minor guilds, the Arti Minori, and citizenship of any meaningful kind required membership in one of them. The major guilds were the lawyers, the wool merchants, the cloth finishers, the silk merchants, the bankers, the physicians and apothecaries, and the furriers. These were the men who ran the city. They sat on the councils. They held the offices. They voted, through the elaborate system of selection that the city had developed, for the priors and the gonfaloniere who managed the day-to-day government of the republic. The minor guilds, the carpenters and bakers and tanners and innkeepers, had their own representation, which was smaller, but they had it. The men with no guild membership at all, the day labourers and the wool carders, the famous Ciompi who had risen in revolt in 1378 and been put down with considerable difficulty, had no political voice. The Medici, when they appeared in the historical record in any prominent way, appeared as members of the Arte del Cambio, the bankers' guild. They had been in Florence for centuries. The name Medici, which means physicians, suggests that some early ancestor had practiced that trade, but by the time the family began to be visible in the records of the city in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they were merchants and bankers with small operations in the city and in the textile trade. They were not, in 1400, a great family. They were not in the top rank of the Florentine merchant aristocracy. The great families of 14th century Florence were the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciauli. These were the names that mattered. The Medici were one tier below. They had money, they had standing, they had a small bank. They were respectable. They were not, however, anyone whom the leading families of the city would have considered competition. This was the city Giovanni di Bicci d'Embecchi was born into in 1360. He was the second son of a father who had died of plague when Giovanni was 3. He had grown up in modest circumstances. He had been apprenticed to a distant cousin who ran a small bank. He had worked his way up. By his 30s he had been sent to Rome to manage the cousin's branch in the papal city, and he had performed well there. And in 1397, at the age of 37, he had set up his own bank with himself as senior partner and a small group of relatives and associates as junior partners, with branches in Florence and Rome and a careful conservative approach to the business that, over the next 4 decades, would make him one of the wealthiest men in Italy. Giovanni di Bicci is the founder of the Medici family fortune. in the sense that everything that came after him was built on the financial structure he established. He was, by all accounts, a careful man. He was prudent. He was not flashy. He dressed simply. He lived in a modest house. He gave alms to the poor without making a public display of it. He attended mass regularly. He served on the city's councils when his guild rotated him into them, but he did not seek high office, and on the occasions when he was elected to one, he served the term and stepped down without trying to extend his influence. The political style of Giovanni de Medici, which his sons and grandsons would inherit and develop, was a style of deliberate quietness. The Medici under Giovanni and after him did not parade their wealth. They did not contest the leadership of the city in open political competition. They worked instead through patronage and clientage and the careful management of the men who owed them money, and they built, slowly and almost invisibly, the network of obligation that would, in time, give them effective control of the Republic without their ever having to take a formal title for it. The bank itself, the Medici Bank as it came to be known, deserves a description, because the bank was the engine of everything that followed. It was, in its mature form, a holding company with branches in the major commercial cities of Europe. The headquarters was in Florence, in a building near the Mercato Vecchio. The branches were in Rome, where the bank handled the financial affairs of the papal court, in Venice, in Geneva, in Avignon, in Bruges, in London, in Lyon. Each branch was managed by a senior partner who was, in most cases, a relative or close associate of the Medici family. The branch managers were, in financial terms, junior partners, with a percentage of the branch's profits and a personal stake in its performance. The capital of the bank was provided by the Medici themselves, who held the controlling interest in every branch, and by the junior partners, whose contributions were smaller but real. The bank's principal business was not, in the sense the modern reader might assume, deposit banking. The bank took deposits, but it did not advertise for them, and did not pay interest on them in any open way, because the Church's prohibition on usury made the open payment of interest a delicate legal matter. The bank's principal business was instead the financing of trade and the management of payments. A Florentine cloth merchant who wanted to sell 100 bolts of finished wool to a London buyer could not, in the early 15th century, simply arrange for the buyer to send him cash. The cash would have had to travel by road and sea, in barrels with armed escorts, across countries at war, with pirates and bandits and tax collectors waiting at every transition. The whole arrangement was impractical. What the merchant did instead was to take his 100 bolts of wool to Bruges, sell them there to a buyer who would then ship them on to London or wherever, and accept payment in the form of a letter of exchange drawn on a Florentine bank. The letter of exchange, when the merchant returned to Florence, would be presented at the bank, which would pay him in Florentine florins, having first deducted a small percentage as a commission. The bank, meanwhile, would settle the account with its branch in Bruges, by means of the next letter of exchange that flowed in the opposite direction. The whole system of European commerce by the 15th century ran on letters of exchange, and the great Italian banks, of which the Medici were the largest, were the engines that made the letters of exchange work. The bank also handled, with particular care, the financial affairs of the papacy. The papacy was, in the early 15th century, the single largest source of revenue in Christendom. The income from the various ecclesiastical fees, taxes, and benefices that flowed to Rome from every diocese of Europe was a sum so large that no other institution of the period came close to it. The popes who had returned to Rome from Avignon at the end of the 14th century needed bankers to manage this revenue, to receive it from the various places it came from, to disperse it for the various purposes it had to be dispersed for, to lend the popes money against future revenue when current revenue was inadequate, and to do all of this with the discretion that the papal court required. The Medici Bank, under Giovanni de Medici, won the contract to handle the papal account in 1410 after a careful campaign of cultivation that had taken Giovanni nearly a decade to mount. From that point on, until the bank's eventual decline in the late 15th century, the Medici were the principal bankers of the popes. The arrangement was extraordinarily profitable. It was also, in due course, extraordinarily useful, because the Medici bank's relationship with the papacy gave the family a connection to Rome that ran beneath the surface of every political and ecclesiastical event of the next 100 years. Giovanni de Medici managed the bank and managed the family's other interests, and lived his quiet life in his modest house for 40 years. He had two sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo, born in the 1390s, both of whom he trained in the family business. He saw the bank prosper. He saw his sons grow into competent managers in their own right. He kept his head down, politically, even as the wealth of the family grew, and he died in 1429, at the age of 69, of natural causes, in his bed, with his family around him. The funeral was a quiet affair. Giovanni had specified in his will that he wanted no elaborate ceremony, no excessive displays of mourning, no expensive monument. He was buried in the family chapel at San Lorenzo in a simple tomb. His estate, according to the tax declaration his sons made the year after his death, was substantial but not by the standards of the great Florentine families. Extraordinary, he left his sons a thriving bank, a network of commercial and political connections, a position of solid respectability in the city, and a set of habits, careful, quiet, patient, that would in due course be of more value to them than any fortune. The sons inherited the habits as much as the money. The habits, in some respects, were the inheritance, and what the sons did with both over the next 30 years would transform the family from one of the comfortable mercantile dynasties of 15th century Florence into the dominant private power in the city, and in due course in much of Italy. The elder son Cosimo was 39 years old when his father died. He was tall by the standards of the period, with a long, thin face that the surviving portraits show in profile, with the high forehead and a slight stoop and the careful, guarded expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life listening more than he speaks. He had been trained, like his father, as a banker. He had served in the family's branches in various Italian cities. He had been to Constantinople, to Geneva, to Bruges. He had developed, in the course of his apprenticeships, a network of personal acquaintances across the commercial cities of Europe that was, by the time he came into his inheritance, perhaps the widest such network of any private citizen of his generation. He spoke Latin. He read Greek, which he had studied with a tutor as a hobby. He had a particular interest in classical literature, which he collected in manuscript form whenever his agents abroad came across copies they could acquire. He was, in his quiet way, one of the most cultured men in Florence. He was also, in his even quieter way, one of the most politically ambitious. The political ambitions of Cosimo de Medici were not the political ambitions of, say, a Renaissance prince in the more dramatic mode. He did not want to wear a crown. He did not want to lead armies. He did not want to make speeches in the public square. What he wanted, as far as the historical record allows us to reconstruct it, was a particular kind of quiet primacy. He wanted to be the man whose advice the city's leaders sought before making decisions. He wanted to be the man whose money the city's officials borrowed when they needed to borrow money. He wanted to be the man whose clients filled the offices that the Constitution distributed by lot. He wanted, in short, to be the center of the network. The formal positions could go to other men. The substance would, by the careful management of patronage and credit, end up in his hands. This was a particular kind of political project, and it was not, in 1429, a project that everyone in Florence approved of. The Albizzi family, which had been the dominant family in the city for the previous generation, watched the Medici with growing concern. The head of the Albizzi, Rinaldo degli Albizzi, was an older man of conservative temperament who had inherited his own family's leadership, and who saw, correctly, that Cosimo's quiet style of operation was, in the long term, a more serious threat to his family's position than any open political challenge would have been. Open challenges could be defeated in the councils. Quiet networks of obligation, accumulating year by year through the management of the bank and the placement of clients in office, were harder to defeat because they were harder to see. Rinaldo degli Albizzi decided, in 1433, that the Medici had to be dealt with. He arranged through the manipulation of the city's selection procedures for a council favourable to himself to be in office, and that council, on the 7th of September 1433, summoned Cosimo de' Medici to the Palazzo della Signoria for a meeting. Cosimo, who had been warned that something was coming, went anyway because to refuse the summons would have given his enemies the pretext for direct action. He was arrested at the meeting, taken to a small cell in the tower of the palace, and held there for 4 weeks while the council deliberated on what to do with him. The deliberations were, by all accounts, intense. The Albizzi faction wanted Cosimo executed. The more cautious members of the council, who were aware of the bank's wide network of foreign creditors, and who did not want to provoke the kind of international financial response that the killing of one of Europe's principal bankers would produce, argued for exile instead. The more cautious view prevailed. Cosimo was sentenced, on the 3rd of October 1433, to 10 years of exile from Florence. He was to be confined to the territory of the Republic of Venice. His brother Lorenzo and various of his cousins were sentenced to lesser exiles in Padua and other cities of the north. The Medici Bank, although technically allowed to continue operating, was understood to be under a cloud, and it was assumed by everyone in the city that the family's political career, such as it had been, was over. Cosimo went into exile. He went, by all accounts, with a careful composure that the men who had sentenced him found unsettling. He took with him, in carts, a substantial portion of the bank's liquid assets, and he transferred the management of the bank's headquarters from Florence to Venice on a temporary basis, where he was, in his place of exile, perfectly able to continue operating. He was received in Venice as a distinguished guest. The Venetian government, which had its own quiet interest in seeing Florence weakened by the loss of one of its leading commercial citizens, offered him every courtesy. He took a house. He set up his exile court. He continued to do business. He waited. The waiting was the part that the Albizzi had not anticipated. The men who had exiled Cosimo had assumed, on the evidence of his quiet style, that he would remain quiet in exile. He did. The waiting was the strategy. Within a year of his exile, the political situation in Florence had begun to deteriorate. The Albizzi government, deprived of the careful Medici management of the city's finances, had run into difficulties. A war with the neighbouring city of Lucca, which the Albizzi had begun in the expectation of a quick victory, had turned into a long, expensive failure. The bank loans the city had taken out to finance. The war had come due. The city's tax revenues had fallen. The councils, which had been packed with Albizzi supporters in 1433, had, by 1434, begun to rotate other men into office, and some of those other men were Medici clients who had been quietly waiting their turn. By the autumn of 1434, the Albizzi position had collapsed. A new council, elected in September of that year, voted to recall Cosimo from exile. He returned to Florence on the 6th of October 1434, almost exactly a year after he had left. He was met at the gates of the city by a procession of his clients and supporters. He went directly to the Palazzo della Signoria, where the new council was waiting to receive him. The Albizzi had by this point fled the city. Rinaldo degli Albizzi went into the exile that he had imposed a year earlier on Cosimo. He never returned to Florence. He died in exile in Ancona 10 years later, in the comfortable but politically irrelevant circumstances that his particular form of failure had earned him. Cosimo, restored to the city, did not take any formal title. He did not become gonfalonier. He returned to his bank. He returned to his house. The only difference, after his return, was that there was no longer anyone in the city in a position to challenge him. The Albizzi were gone. The other great families had either been allied with the Albizzi and were now politically discredited, or had been allied with the Medici and were now in his debt. The city, without anyone in it having to vote on the matter formally, had become, in effect, the Medici's city. The transformation had been managed without a single battle, without a single execution, without a single change in the formal constitution. It had been managed by exile and return, by the patient management of the bank, by the slow accumulation of the network of obligation that Giovanni de Bicci had begun and that Cosimo had inherited. And it had been managed in such a way that, when the dust settled, the Medici were the dominant family in Florence, and the Florentine Republic was still technically a republic, and nobody in the city, including the Medici themselves, was in any great hurry to change the technical situation, because the technical situation had served the family extremely well. This was the foundation. Everything else, the palazzo, the artists, the popes, the queens, the dukes, the long centuries of cultural patronage, the eventual quiet ending in 1743, all of it was built on the foundation that Cosimo de' Medici laid in the autumn of 1434, when he came back to Florence from his year in Venice and resumed, without ceremony, the careful work that his father had begun and that he himself had been training all his adult life to continue. The palazzo we have been walking through tonight, the building where the kitchen woman is laying her morning fire in 1469, was Cosimo's idea. He commissioned it. He paid for it. He moved into it. And in the building of it, he set the model for what a Florentine private palace of the High Renaissance was going to look like for the next century. The site he chose was on the Via Larga, which is the street that now bears his family name, the Via Cavour having been renamed in the 19th century from the Via Larga that the Medici had built it on. The site was 3 streets east of the great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, with its dome by Brunelleschi that was still, when Cosimo bought the land in the 1440s, in the final stages of being completed. The site was 3 streets north of the church of San Lorenzo, the family's parish church, which Cosimo was simultaneously rebuilding at his own expense, and where the family chapel and the family tombs were being installed in their final form. The location was deliberate. The palazzo, the church, and the cathedral formed, between them, the 3 points of the small triangle within which the daily life of the Medici was lived. Cosimo, for the rest of his life, walked between these 3 buildings several times a week, on foot, with a single servant, in the simple dark wool gown that the merchants of Florence wore. The walk took perhaps 10 minutes from one end to the other. The walk was in the deepest practical sense, the geography of the family. The palazzo itself was designed, after some negotiation, by Michelangelo di Bartolomeo, a careful and underrated architect of the period whose work for the Medici over 4 decades produced not only the Palazzo Medici, but also the rebuilt monastery of San Marco, the family villa at Cafaggiolo, the rebuilt church of Santissima Annunziata, and various smaller works around the city. Michelangelo was a friend of Cosimo's from younger days. He was trusted. He understood what the family wanted, which was a building that would be unmistakably grand without being, in the technical language of the period, presumptuous. The original design by Brunelleschi had been rejected by Cosimo as too elaborate. The Brunelleschi design, which survives in description, would have been one of the most spectacular private buildings in Italy. Cosimo turned it down. Brunelleschi, by tradition, smashed the model in fury and never spoke to Cosimo again. The Michelangelo design, which Cosimo accepted, was more restrained. It was still, in 1444 when construction began, the largest private house in Florence by a clear margin, but it was restrained. The restraint was the point. The Medici, in the careful style they had developed over 2 generations, did not flaunt the building which still stands and which the visitor to Florence can still walk into, is a 3-story rectangular block of pale stone with a heavily rusticated ground floor a slightly less rusticated second floor, and a smooth ashlar third floor, capped by a deep projecting cornice that throws a sharp shadow across the upper story in the strong Tuscan sunlight. The stone is the local pietra forte, a yellowish sandstone that ages well and that the masons of the city had been working with for centuries. The proportions are calm. The windows of the upper stories are tall, with the round arches that the Renaissance had recovered from classical models. The doors at street level are large enough to admit a carriage, but no larger. The whole effect, in the streetscape of 15th century Florence, was of a building that was unmistakably the house of a great family, but that did not, in any of its details, push the point harder than the family standing required. The interior was organized around a central courtyard, the cortile, which in the Florentine palazzo of the period was the architectural and social heart of the building. The cortile of the Palazzo Medici was, and is, a small square space with a colonnade running around all four sides at ground level, with arched openings between the columns and a fountain in the centre. The colonnade gave shelter from the sun and the rain. The fountain provided water and a small constant sound. The walls of the colonnade behind the columns were painted with frescoes. The capitals of the columns were carved with the Medici arms, the 6 balls or pallae that the family had used as its emblem since the previous century. The pallae appeared everywhere in the house, on the capitals, on the keystones of the arches, on the friezes, on the andirons of the fireplaces, on the silver of the dining service, on the embroidered hangings of the beds. The pallae were the visual signature of the family. They were the thing that in any room of the palazzo told a visitor whose house they were standing in. In the centre of the cortile, on a stone plinth, stood a bronze statue. The statue was of a young man. He was naked. He was holding, in his right hand, a sword. He had his left foot on a severed head. The young man was David. The head was Goliath. The statue was by Donatello, and it was the first life-size, freestanding, naked male bronze of any kind that had been cast since Roman antiquity, and it stood in the courtyard of the Medici Palace because Cosimo de' Medici had commissioned it, paid for it, and placed it there, where every visitor to the house, from a passing creditor to a visiting cardinal, would walk past it on the way in, and would understand, without anyone having to explain, that the family that owned the house owned also the most advanced sculpture in the modern world. The Donatello David is now in the Bargello Museum, where the visitor can still see it, and where the impact of standing in front of it is still, 6 centuries later, considerable. In 1469, when our mourning is taking place, it stood in the courtyard of the palazzo, and the kitchen woman whose fire we left lit a few pages ago walked past it every morning on her way from the kitchen courtyard to the wells in the main courtyard to fetch additional water. She did not on the whole stop and look at it. She had walked past it by 1469, perhaps 1,000 times. The David was not, for her, an art object. The David was the statue in the courtyard. The statue had been there since before she had come to work in the house, and it would be there after she had left. And the relationship she had with it was the easy, unself-conscious relationship of a person who lives, daily, in proximity to objects that the rest of the world considers extraordinary and that she considers part of the furniture. Monthus. This was, in some respects, the secret of the Medici life. The Medici lived among art, the way other people live among kitchen utensils. The art was there, the art was used. The painters who painted the Medici were paid by the same household budget that paid the kitchen women and the grooms and the laundresses. The artists were, in some cases, friends of the family. They were, in other cases, employees. They were, in all cases, treated as part of the working life of the house, with the easy familiarity that the household reserved for the people it knew well. Donatello, who had cast the David, was a regular dinner guest at the Palazzo for 40 years. Botticelli, who would in the next generation paint the birth of Venus and the Primavera for Lorenzo's cousin's villa, was the son of a tanner who lived 2 streets away and who had grown up running errands in the same neighborhood. Michelangelo, who would be discovered as a teenager and brought into the household, would sleep in a small bedchamber on the 2nd floor and would eat at the same table as Lorenzo and his sons, and would later say, in old age, that the years he had spent in the Medici household had been the formative years of his life. The art was made by people. The people were, in the Medici house, neighbours. Let us walk, briefly, through the main rooms of the palazzo, because the arrangement of the rooms tells us something about how the daily life of the family worked. On the ground floor around the courtyard were the offices of the bank's Florentine headquarters, which had moved into the new building shortly after its completion. The room where Cosimo received clients and creditors was a large vaulted chamber on the south side, with 3 tall windows opening onto the Via Larga and a heavy wooden table in the centre, at which the senior partners of the bank conducted their business. Behind it, smaller rooms held the clerks and the strong boxes and the ledgers in which the bank's accounts were kept. The ground floor was the working part of the house. It was open during business hours to anyone who had legitimate business with the bank. The men who came in were merchants, lawyers, agents from foreign branches, ambassadors of foreign governments who needed to negotiate loans, the occasional cardinal in town from Rome, and the steady stream of small Florentine clients who had small Florentine accounts with the bank and who needed to deposit or withdraw modest sums. The activity at the ground floor was the activity of a working financial institution, and it gave the lower part of the building a particular character that the upper floors did not share. The first floor was the family's principal living quarters. A great staircase led up from the cortile to a long gallery, which ran the length of the building on the courtyard side. From the gallery, doors opened onto the major rooms. There was the great hall, the salon, which was used for formal dining when the family received guests in numbers, and which was hung with tapestries from the family's collection and lit in the evenings by chandeliers of Venetian glass. There was the chapel, the Cappella dei Magi, which was small but elaborate, with frescoes by Benozzo Gozzoli running around 3 of its walls, depicting the procession of the Magi in such a way that the various figures in the procession bore, in their faces, the unmistakable likenesses of various members of the Medici family. The chapel was the private place of devotion of the household. The family attended Mass there in the morning, before the day's business began. The frescoes, with their cousins and uncles and grandfathers riding out among the Magi in their 15th century Florentine finery, were the family's way of placing themselves visually in the long sacred history that the chapel commemorated. There were, in addition, the various private apartments, the bedchambers and dressing rooms and small studies and reading rooms that the principal members of the family used. Cosimo's own bedchamber was on the 1st floor, with a window looking down onto the cortile. His study, which he called his scrittoio, was a small room next to the bedchamber, walled with shelves on which he kept his collection of books, which by the time of his death numbered over 1,000 volumes, the largest private library in Italy, and one of the largest private libraries in Europe. The books were a mixture of medieval theological works, classical Latin texts, the new translations from Greek that Cosimo had been commissioning for years, and the small private notebooks in which Cosimo had been recording his own thoughts and observations. He spent, in his later years, several hours a day in this room. He read, he wrote, he looked out of the small window at the cortile and the David. He thought, in the slow, patient way of a man who had spent his life in the shadows of his city's politics, about the long arrangements he had been making and the further arrangements that the years he had left would or would not allow him to make. The 2nd floor of the palazzo housed the secondary apartments, the rooms of the younger members of the family, senior household servants, and the various reception rooms that were used for less formal occasions. The 3rd floor, at the top of the building, held the servants' quarters, the storerooms, and the great pantries in which the household's food and wine were kept. The whole vertical organization of the building, the bank at the bottom, The family in the middle, the servants and the stores at the top, was a model of the Florentine palazzo of the period, and the model would be repeated, with variations, in dozens of other palazzi that the great families of the city built for themselves over the next half-century. Outside the building, on the south side, the family had laid out a garden. The garden was a Renaissance garden in the style that was just then beginning to develop. It had geometric beds. It had small fountains. It had statuary, classical and contemporary, placed at the intersections of the paths. It had a small enclosed courtyard at one end, where the antique sculptures the family had been collecting from the Roman ruins were displayed in a kind of private museum. The garden was used for evening entertainments in the warm months, for small dinners in the loggia that opened off it, for the philosophical conversations that, under Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo, would become one of the famous features of the Medici household. The garden was, in some respects, the most private part of the palazzo, the part that only the family and its closest associates ever saw. This was the building. Now let us walk through a day in it. A working day in the Palazzo Medici in 1469 began, as we have already seen, before dawn, in the kitchen courtyard, where the household servants laid the morning fires and received the morning deliveries from the markets. By 6 o'clock in the summer, by 7 in the winter, the kitchen was operating at full capacity. The breakfast for the family, which was a relatively light meal in the 15th century Tuscan style, was being prepared. Bread, fresh from the bakery a street away. Fruit in season. Small portions of cheese. A thin meat broth in winter. A glass of watered wine for the men. A glass of water, sometimes flavoured with rose petals or orange flower water, for the women and children. The breakfast was served in the smaller dining room on the first floor, not in the great salon, because the great salon was reserved for guests, and breakfast was a family meal. The family came down to the breakfast in stages. Cosimo, in his last years, was an early riser, and was usually at the table by 6:30 in his plain dark gown, with a small book of prayers in his hand. His son Piero, who in 1469 was the official head of the family but who was failing rapidly from gout and would be dead before the end of the year, sometimes came down and sometimes did not, depending on the state of his hands and feet on the particular morning. Lorenzo, the grandson who would in a few months become the head of the family, was usually at the table by 7, in the lighter-coloured clothes of a young man. His brother Giuliano, 4 years younger, was usually with him. The women of the family, Lorenzo's mother Lucrezia Tornabuoni and his sister Bianca, and the various aunts and cousins who lived in the household, came down separately, often later, with their attending women. The household servants, who had eaten their own breakfast in the kitchen courtyard at 5, were on duty around the table, serving the dishes, refilling the cups, removing the plates as they were finished with. The breakfast conversation was, by all accounts, surprisingly informal. The Medici were not a household that observed great ceremony in private. The men talked about the day's business. The women talked about household matters, the planning of dinners, the management of the country properties, the placing of children in religious houses or in marriages or in apprenticeships. The conversation moved between Florentine dialect, which was the working language of the household, and Latin, which the educated members of the family used when they wanted to be precise about a particular point. The children, when they were old enough to be at the table, listened. They learned over the years by listening. The Medici education was conducted in significant part at the family table, and the children who grew up at it acquired, by the time they were 12 or 13, an unusual breadth of practical, political and commercial knowledge. After breakfast, the men of the family went down to the bank. The bank, in the ground floor offices that we have already walked through, opened for business at 7 in the morning and remained open until midday, and then again from 2 until 6. Cosimo, in his last years, came down to the bank for an hour or two each morning, principally to receive visitors who had come specifically to speak to him rather than to one of the junior partners. Piero, when he was well enough, did the same. Lorenzo, in 1469, was being trained for the position he would soon inherit, and he spent most mornings at the bank, sitting in on meetings, reading the correspondence, asking questions, learning the business that he would, in due course, be running. The correspondence of the bank in any given week was enormous. Letters arrived from every branch, from agents in foreign cities, from clients with concerns or instructions or complaints, from the papal court in Rome, from the courts of foreign princes, from the small private correspondents who were the bank's principal sources of intelligence about events in the wider world. The letters were read, translated where necessary, and answered by a team of secretaries who worked under the direction of the senior partners. The letters in any given month constituted, in their accumulated form, one of the most comprehensive private intelligence networks in 15th century Europe. The Medici, through their bank, knew what was happening in the courts of France and Burgundy and Milan and Naples and the German Empire and the kingdoms of Spain, often before the official ambassadors of those courts had reported the same news to their own governments. The information was the bank's business. It was also, in the wider sense, the family's political capital. The Medici knew things, and the knowing was the foundation of the influence they exercised in their city and beyond it. The midday meal, the dinner in the Florentine sense of the period, was the principal meal of the day. It was served in the great salon when there were guests, and in the smaller dining room when there were not. It began at midday or shortly after, and it lasted, in its full form, perhaps 2 hours. The food, which we are going to come to in more detail in a moment, was elaborate by modern standards, but restrained by the standards of 15th century princely courts. The Medici, in their style of eating as dressing, did not flaunt. The dishes were good. The dishes were various. The dishes were served on plates of silver and on the painted Maya liquor that the family had been collecting for years. The wine was Tuscan, from the family's own vineyards in the Chianti Hills, and from the vineyards of friends and associates around the city. The conversation, especially when guests were present, ranged across the day's news, the latest dispatches from the bank, the small political crises of the moment, the literary and artistic projects that the family was sponsoring at any given time. The dinner was where the Medici did, in significant part, their cultural patronage. The artists, the writers, the philosophers, the visiting scholars from Constantinople or Rome or Paris were brought to the dinner. They sat at the table. They talked. The family, in the easy, familiar manner that was its style, listened and asked questions and contributed and absorbed. After dinner, the family rested. The siesta, the long, warm afternoon of the Italian summer, was observed in the Medici household as it was observed in every other household of the Mediterranean world. The men retired to their studies or their bedchambers. The women retired to their apartments. The children, who had attended the dinner from a certain age onward, were taken away by their nurses or their tutors. The servants cleared the dining room and went, in their turn, to whatever afternoon rest the household schedule permitted them. The palazzo, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, was a quiet building. The shutters were closed against the heat. The cortile was in shade. The David, in the centre of the cortile, stood in the silence that the afternoon imposed on the whole city. In the late afternoon, the household resumed activity. The bank reopened. The men returned to their offices. The women, in the cooler hours of the afternoon, walked in the garden, received visits from female relatives and friends, attended to the small business of the household that they had not had time to attend to in the morning. The children went to their lessons. The Medici children, like the children of most of the great Florentine families, were educated in significant part at home, by tutors who were brought into the household for the purpose. The tutors taught Latin, Greek, mathematics, music, the classical literature that the Renaissance had recovered, the modern Italian poetry that the city was producing in such quantities. Lorenzo, as a child, had been tutored by Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher who would become, in his adult life, one of the great translators of Plato into Latin, and the relationship between teacher and pupil that Ficino had established with the young Lorenzo would, over the years, become one of the deepest intellectual friendships of either man's life. The evening meal, the supper in the Florentine sense, was lighter than the dinner. It was served at perhaps 8 o'clock in summer, earlier in winter. It was more informal. The family ate often in the loggia that opened off the garden, with the evening cool coming in through the open arches and the sound of the fountain in the courtyard providing a soft background to the conversation. The supper was the meal at which the day's events were reviewed. The decisions that had been made in the morning were reviewed in the light of how the day had gone. The plans for the next day were sketched. The small intimacies of family life, which the more public meals of the day did not always permit, found their way into the supper conversation. The supper, in some respects, was the most private of the family's daily occasions, and the household servants who attended it were the senior servants who had been with the family for years and who could be trusted with the more confidential parts of the conversation. After supper, the family separated. Some of the men, especially in Lorenzo's generation, went out into the city, to the houses of friends, to the small intellectual gatherings at the Platonic Academy that Cosimo had founded and that Lorenzo would in his time expand. Some of them stayed in the palazzo and read, or wrote, or worked on the small private projects that the day had not allowed them to attend to. The women, on the whole, stayed in. They sewed, they read, they talked among themselves, they prepared the household in its small ways for the night. By 11 o'clock, in most seasons, the palazzo was quiet. The lamps were extinguished. The shutters were closed. The fountain in the cortile was, from a distance, the loudest sound in the building. The David in the moonlight that came down through the open top of the courtyard stood in the silence that was in its way the building's truest hour. This was the daily rhythm. This was the architecture of time within which the long Medici life took place. The morning's work, the midday meal, the afternoon's rest, the evening supper, the night's quiet. The pattern was the same, with variations, every day for 52 weeks of every year, with the exceptions of the great religious feasts and the periodic departures to the country villas and the occasional crises that broke the rhythm without, on the whole, ever quite breaking it for long. The Medici lived inside this rhythm. The rhythm was the wealth in the deepest sense, because the rhythm was what the wealth made possible, to live every day inside a building of this kind, with food of this quality, with art on the walls, with servants attending, with the long unhurried movement from morning to midday to afternoon to evening to night, was the texture of what 15th century Florence understood by being rich. The objects, the silver, the silks, the paintings, were the small daily evidence that the rhythm had been achieved. We have to talk about the clothes, because the clothes were one of the most visible parts of the Medici life, and because the clothes have, in the modern imagination, become one of the most recognizable features of the Renaissance world. The Medici, like all the great families of 15th century Florence, dressed in the textiles that the city produced. The textiles were the city's wealth, and the wealth wore them. The principal materials were wool and silk, with linen for undergarments and for the clothes of the household servants, and small quantities of cotton imported from the eastern Mediterranean for particular specialized uses. The wool was the wool of the city's trade, finished to the high standard that the Florentine cloth finishers had perfected over centuries. The silk was the silk of Lucca and of the eastern Mediterranean, imported as raw thread and woven, in the silk workshops of the city, into the heavy patterned damasks and brocades that the wealthy of Italy demanded. The silks were the prestige fabric. The wealthy of the period had, between them, an entire vocabulary for the various types of silk that the workshops produced. There was velvet, the heavy pile fabric that was woven on specially adapted looms, and that was, in its top grades, more expensive per yard than almost any other textile. There was damask, a flat, figured silk in which the pattern was woven into the fabric by the contrast of warp and weft, producing a subtle two-tone effect that changed character as the light moved across it. There was brocade, in which the pattern was raised above the surface of the silk by the addition of supplementary weft threads, often in gold or silver, producing a heavy textured fabric that caught the light in particular ways. There was taffeta, a lighter, more crisp silk used for linings and for lighter garments. There was satin, with its smooth, lustrous face, and silk gauze for veils, and silk tabby for the most everyday silk garments of the household. The colours in the heavy patterned silks were limited but rich. The dye industry of the period had access to a particular set of colours that the chemistry of the time permitted. The deep crimsons made from the kermes insect or from the more expensive cochineal were the prestige colours, with the deepest crimson being so expensive that it functioned in some respects as a status marker reserved for cardinals and kings. The deep blues, made from indigo or from the rarer and more expensive lapis-derived ultramarines, were used for the robes of the Madonna in religious painting and for particularly fine private garments. The greens, made from various combinations of yellow and blue dyes, were less prestigious because they were less colour-fast. The yellows from saffron and from various other plant sources faded easily and were used mostly for less formal garments. The black, deep, saturated black was perhaps the most expensive colour of all, because the chemistry of producing a true rich black from the available dyes was so difficult that only the best dyers could achieve it, and the cloth they produced commanded prices that put it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest customers. The dyers themselves, as a working trade in the city, deserve a moment, because the dye industry of 15th century Florence was one of the principal economic engines on which the entire wealth of the city, including the wealth of the Medici, ultimately rested. The dyeing of cloth in Florence was a regulated industry, conducted in workshops that were concentrated in particular quarters of the city, near the river, where the large quantities of water that the dyeing process required could be drawn directly from the Arno. The dye houses were unpleasant places to work in. The dyes had to be heated in great vats. The vats produced steam, and the steam carried the smells of the dyestuffs, which in the case of the deep blues, made from the woad plant fermented over weeks in vats that contained, among other things, large quantities of stale urine to provide the necessary alkalinity, were memorable in ways that the rest of the city, when the wind was wrong, could appreciate from some distance. The workers in the dye houses, who were called the tintori, were among the lower-paid artisans of the city. They were also among the most skilled. The mastering of the chemistry of dyeing, the timing of the soakings, the temperature of the vats, the mordants that fixed the colours into the cloth, was a craft that took years to learn, and that the masters of it guarded jealously from outsiders. The wool that came into the city from the flocks of central Italy and from the long-distance trade with England and Spain was, after spinning and weaving, brought to the dyers, who turned the white or grey cloth into the brilliant colours that made the cloth saleable across Europe at the prices that supported the entire commercial life of the city. The cloth, when it left the dyers, went to the finishers, who fulled it and napped it and sheared it and pressed it. It went, when the finishing was complete, to the merchants, who packaged it and shipped it. The merchants, who had often advanced the capital that paid for the wool and the dye, took the largest share of the profits. The dyers, who had done the technically most demanding work, took a smaller share. The arrangement was, by the standards of the period, fair enough, and the system, in its layered division of labour, produced cloth of a quality that the rest of Europe could not match, and at prices that made the wealthy of every European court the customers of the Florentine workshops. The Medici, in their bank, financed the merchants who bought the cloth. The Medici, in their wardrobes, wore the most expensive grades of the same cloth. The Medici, in their tax payments, contributed to the public revenues that the city used to maintain the regulations that kept the cloth industry profitable. The whole arrangement was a circulation, and the family stood, in the circulation, at several different points simultaneously, drawing income from each of them. The Medici, in their style of dress as architecture, leaned toward the restrained end of the colour spectrum. The portraits of Cosimo show him almost always in a dark red gown, plain in cut, without elaborate sleeves or trim. The portraits of Piero, his son, are slightly more elaborate, with gold thread embroidery at the cuffs and collar, but still restrained by comparison with the great princes of the period. The portraits of Lorenzo, taken in his middle years, show him in similar dark gowns, with a simple hat and a chain of office only when the occasion required it. The Medici men, in their daily dress, wore the clothes of substantial Florentine merchants. They did not, on the whole, wear the more elaborate clothes that would have been available to them, and that some of their contemporaries did wear. The restraint was, again, deliberate. The family's particular style of dominance required that they not, in the visible markers of their status, push the point harder than was necessary. The women's clothes were a different matter. The women of the Medici household, like the women of all the great families of the period, wore clothes of considerable elaboration. The basic garment was the gamura, a long-fitted gown, worn over a linen shift, with long-fitted sleeves often laced on separately at the shoulder. Over the gamura, for formal occasions, was worn the giornia, a sleeveless overgown, often of a different colour or fabric, that was open at the sides and that gave the wearer a particular silhouette in motion. Over both, in cool weather, was worn the chioppa, a heavy outer gown with full sleeves, of wool or silk, that completed the outfit. The whole arrangement, in its formal version, involved 3 or 4 different garments worn simultaneously in carefully coordinated fabrics and colours, with embroidery and trim and small jewelled ornaments at the points where the various layers met. The hair was dressed in the Florentine style of the period, in elaborate arrangements that varied by age and marital status and the particular fashion of the year. Young unmarried women wore their hair, in many cases long and loose down the back, with a small ornamental cap or a band of fabric across the forehead. Married women dressed their hair in more elaborate styles, with the hair gathered into nets of gold or silver thread, or wrapped in turbans of patterned silk, or arranged in coils held in place by jewelled pins. The Botticelli paintings of the period, which are among the most reliable visual records of how the women of the Medici circle actually looked, show the elaborate variety of these arrangements with a precision that suggests Botticelli was painting from observation rather than convention. The jewellery was significant. The wealthy women of 15th century Florence wore considerable quantities of jewellery, in particular configurations that the period had developed for the purpose. There were the long pearl necklaces that the Botticelli portraits show. There were the large pendant brooches that were pinned to the front of the gown. There were the small finger rings, often inscribed with mottos or names, that the women wore in numbers that the modern eye finds excessive. There were the elaborate gold and enamel pendants that hung from the centre of the necklace at the breastbone. The whole arrangement, on a formal occasion, represented an investment of capital that, in some cases, could rival the value of a small house. The jewellery was in part decoration, was also in part mobile capital, the kind of value that could be carried out of a city in a hurry if a sudden change of political fortune required it. The wealthy women of the period understood this. The jewellery was prudence as well as ornament. The sumptuary laws of the city deserve a moment's attention here, because they are one of the more revealing features of 15th century Florentine social life. The city, like most Italian cities of the period, had laws restricting the kinds of clothes that various categories of people could wear. The laws were intended, in their official rationale, to prevent excessive expenditure on personal display, to discourage moral laxity, and to maintain the visible markers of social rank. The laws were also, in their actual operation, almost completely ignored. The wealthy women of the city wore what they wanted to wear, and when they were prosecuted for violations, which happened periodically, they paid the fines with the resigned attitude of people for whom the fines were a small and tolerable cost of doing business. The Medici women, like the women of all the wealthy families, were caught in this dance with the law in various ways over the years. They wore clothes that exceeded the legal limits. They were fined. They paid the fines. They wore the clothes again the next week. The whole arrangement was, in some respects, an elaborate theatre, in which the city periodically reasserted its disapproval of luxury, and the wealthy periodically reasserted their indifference to the disapproval. And the fines that were levied went into the city treasury and helped to pay for, among other things, the public works that the same wealthy families were also funding through their taxes and their voluntary contributions. Now we come to the food, because the food, in any account of how the wealthy of 15th century Florence actually lived, deserves a careful description. The Medici, like the rest of the Florentine elite, ate well. They did not eat, on the whole, in the manner of the more spectacular princely courts of the period. They did not produce the elaborate set-piece banquets that the Burgundian court was famous for, with the sugar sculptures of castles and the live birds released from pies, and the courses choreographed to musical accompaniment. The Medici style of eating, like dressing and building, was restrained by the standards of the great courts. It was, however, restrained from a baseline of considerable abundance, and the meals that the family ate every day in the smaller dining room on the first floor would, in most households of 15th century Europe, have been considered the meals of a great occasion. The morning meal we have already described in passing. It was light. It was based on bread and fruit and small quantities of cheese, with watered wine for the men and infusions for the women. The midday dinner was the principal meal. It was elaborate. It was, on a typical day, in 5 or 6 courses. The first course was the antipasto, which in the 15th century Tuscan style consisted of small dishes of salted and cured meats, of pickled vegetables, of small portions of seafood when seafood was available. The salami of Tuscany, which the household made in significant quantities at the country estates and brought into the city in the autumn, were a particular speciality. The cured prosciutto, hung in the cellars of the country villas through the cold months and brought out in spring, was another. The small marinated artichokes, the salted anchovies, the pickled mushrooms, the slices of cured tongue, all appeared on the antipasto plates of a typical Medici dinner. The dishes were small. The variety was considerable. The eaters chose what they wanted. The second course, the minestra, was a soup or pasta dish. The Tuscan soups of the period were the soups that the modern Tuscan kitchen still recognizes: the ribollita with its bread and beans and cabbage, the papa al pomodoro with its bread and tomato in the seasons when tomato was available, the various brodi of meat, broth thickened with rice or with the small dumplings that the Florentine cooks made from breadcrumbs and herbs. The pasta dishes were various. The fresh pasta that the household kitchen made every morning was served with simple sauces of butter and cheese, or with the small quantities of meat ragu that the cooks prepared from the previous day's roasts, or with the chickpea-based sauces that were used during the periods of religious fasting, when meat was forbidden. The pasta of the period was not, on the whole, the dried pasta of the modern factory. It was fresh egg pasta, made by hand each morning, cut into the various shapes that the particular dish required. The third course was the principal meat course. The Medici ate, in the course of an ordinary week, a wide variety of meats. Beef, from the large white Chianina cattle that were bred in the family's country estates, was served roasted in the simple Florentine style, with salt and rosemary and the pure olive oil that the estates produced in considerable quantities. Pork from the same estates was served in various forms: roasted, braised, salted. Veal was a particular delicacy, and the small spring veals that the country properties produced were brought into the city for the Easter and the spring feast days. Game, in the seasons when game was permitted, was abundant on the Medici table. The hares and the partridges and the quails and the pigeons that the family's hunting parties produced from the estates were brought to the kitchen and prepared with the herb and wine sauces that the period favoured. The fourth course was, on most days, a vegetable course. The vegetables of the Tuscan kitchen of the 15th century were, in some respects, more limited than the modern Italian kitchen, because the principal New World vegetables, the tomato and the potato and the various peppers, had not yet arrived in Italy in any significant quantity. The tomato, in particular, would not become a routine ingredient in the Italian kitchen for nearly 2 centuries after the period we are describing. The Medici did not eat tomatoes. They ate, instead, the older Mediterranean vegetables, the artichokes, the fennel, the spinach, the chard, the cabbage, the various greens that the kitchen gardens produced. The dishes were prepared simply, with olive oil and lemon and the herbs of the kitchen garden, and they were served as a separate course, in significant portions, in the way that the Italian table has done for centuries. The fifth course was the dessert. The desserts of the period were not, on the whole, the elaborate sugar confections that would become standard in the courts of the next century, although the Medici, who imported sugar in significant quantities, did sometimes serve sweet dishes that involved sugar. The principal dessert of the daily meal was fruit. Fresh fruit in season, the peaches and the grapes and the figs and the pears that the country estates produced, was brought to the table in pyramids on silver platters. Dried fruit, in the seasons when fresh fruit was not available, was served on smaller dishes: almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, small portions of crystallized fruit. The various candied citrons and orange peels that the household preserved for the cold months. The dessert was in most cases the simplest course of the meal, and the people who ate it, the Medici and their guests, considered the simplicity to be a virtue. The wine was Tuscan. The vineyards of the Chianti Hills produced the red wines that the family drank with their meals, and the lighter whites of the Trebbiano grape were drunk with the lighter dishes and in the warmer months. The wine was served in small glass goblets, often of Venetian make. The drinking of wine in the 15th century Tuscan style was moderate. The wines were of moderate strength. The amounts consumed at any single meal were modest. The water was, on most occasions, the principal beverage of the meal, with the wine taken in small portions to accompany particular courses. This was the daily eating, the feast days, the great religious occasions, the weddings and the births and the receptions for distinguished foreign guests, produced meals of greater elaboration. A Medici wedding banquet of the late 15th century could involve 15 or 20 courses. A reception for a visiting head of state could involve more. The cooks of the household on these occasions produced the more elaborate dishes that the period had developed: the roasted peacocks dressed in their feathers, the great pies containing surprises, the sugar sculptures, the elaborate fruit pieces. But these were exceptions. The daily eating was the daily eating, and it was in its restrained Tuscan way one of the principal pleasures of a wealthy life in 15th century Florence. The artists, as we have already noted, were part of the household. This is the part of the Medici life that the modern reader, looking back at the period through 6 centuries of subsequent art history, has the hardest time fully reconstructing. The artists of the Florentine Renaissance, the men whose names now fill the rooms of museums and the chapters of textbooks, were in their own time working craftsmen. They were paid by the commission. They lived in the city. They had workshops with apprentices. They competed for jobs. They negotiated prices. They delivered, on time and on budget, the works that they had been commissioned to produce. They were not, in their own self-understanding, the romantic geniuses that later periods would make them out to be. They were skilled professionals at the top of their trade, and the Medici, as the wealthiest and most consistently active patrons in the city, were the clients with whom every working artist of the period wanted, ideally, to do business. Donatello, who had cast the David, had been a friend of Cosimo since their younger days. He was perhaps 15 years older than Cosimo. He had begun his career in the workshop of Lorenzo de Medici, who was producing the great bronze doors of the baptistery in Florence in the early decades of the 15th century. Donatello had worked on the doors as an apprentice. He had moved on in the 1410s to independent commissions, producing the marble figures for the niches of Orsan Michele and the great wooden crucifixion for Santa Croce that by tradition his friend Brunelleschi criticized so severely that Donatello, in response, made him a better one. The two crucifixes still hang in the city, and the visitor who walks between them can still feel the small private rivalry of two great working sculptors at the start of their careers. Donatello had moved into Cosimo's circle in the 1420s. He had become, by the 1430s, the family's principal sculptor for major commissions. He had cast the David in the late 1430s or 1440s, the exact date is disputed, for the courtyard of the new Palazzo. He had produced the great bronze pulpits for San Lorenzo, which the visitor to the church can still see, with their reliefs of the Passion and the Resurrection that are among the most disturbing and powerful pieces of late medieval sculpture in existence. He had produced, for the family's country estate at Cafaggiolo, smaller works in bronze and marble that are scattered now across the museums of the world. He had, in his old age, been brought back to Florence by Cosimo when his other commissions had dried up, and Cosimo had given him a small pension and a small house and the standing instruction to come to dinner whenever he wanted to come. The pension and the house were the kinds of arrangements that the Medici made, quietly and consistently, for the artists they considered worth supporting. The arrangement was not, in any formal sense, employment. The artist remained an independent practitioner, free to take other commissions, but the small, steady support of the Medici household provided a baseline of security that allowed the artist to work on the longer and more ambitious projects that pure commission work would not have permitted. Donatello, in his last years, in the late 1450s and the 1460s, was supported by Cosimo in this way, and the works he produced in those years, in the relative freedom that the support gave him, are among the most adventurous and unconventional of his career. When Donatello died in 1466, he was buried, by Cosimo's instruction, in the Medici family chapel at San Lorenzo, near Cosimo himself. Cosimo had died 2 years earlier. The two old men, who had been friends for 50 years, were buried within yards of each other, in the church that one of them had paid to rebuild, and the other had filled with sculpture. The arrangement is one of the small revealing details of the Medici household. The artist and the patron were, in the deepest sense, in this together. The work the artist had made was the work the patron had paid for. The bones of both men, when their lives were over, were in the same building. The relationship had been a working one, with money changing hands and contracts being negotiated, and the small frictions that any long professional relationship produces, but it had also been at the level the friendship operated on. A real friendship between two men who had known each other since they were young. Botticelli, the next great artist to enter the Medici household, was a different kind of figure. He was younger, born in the 1440s. He was not an old friend of the family. He was the son of a tanner who lived in a working-class neighborhood near the river, and his connection to the Medici came through the family's collateral line, through Cosimo's son Pier Francesco and his sons, who lived in a separate palazzo a few streets away from the main family house. Botticelli was discovered by the family in the 1470s. He produced in the years that followed the works that have made him perhaps the most famous painter of the Florentine Renaissance, The Birth of Venus and the Primavera, both of which were painted for the country villa of the family's collateral branch, and both of which now hang in the Uffizi a few minutes' walk from the Palazzo Medici. Botticelli's relationship with the family was different from Donatello's because he was a different kind of person. He was, by all accounts, a more nervous and self-conscious figure than the older sculptor. He was, in his middle years, drawn into the religious enthusiasm that would, in the 1490s, sweep the city, and he became, in his later years, a follower of the preacher Savonarola, whose movement we will come to in due course. The Botticelli of the late 1490s burned by tradition, some of his own paintings on the same bonfires of the vanities that consumed so much else of the family's accumulated culture. He was a more troubled man than his colleagues, but in the years of his association with the Medici, in the 1470s and 1480s, he was the painter who, more than any other, gave visual form to the particular synthesis of classical mythology and Christian devotion that the Medici intellectual circle had been developing under the influence of the philosopher Marsilio Ficino, whom we have already met as the young Lorenzo's tutor. The Platonic Academy, which the older Cosimo had founded in his last years, and which Lorenzo expanded, was the intellectual heart of the Medici cultural project. It was not technically an academy in the institutional sense. It had no charter, no membership rolls, no set program of study. It was, instead, a gathering of philosophers and scholars who met, irregularly but consistently, at the Medici villa at Careggi outside the city, under Ficino's intellectual leadership, to read and discuss the works of Plato that Ficino was, over the course of decades, translating from the Greek into Latin. The translations were the work of a lifetime. Ficino completed the first complete Latin translation of Plato's dialogues in the 1480s, and the publication of the translation, with the financial support of the Medici, was one of the great intellectual events of the European Renaissance. The dialogues had been known in fragmentary form throughout the medieval period, but the complete corpus, in a careful Latin version, had not been available since classical antiquity. Ficino's translation made it available, and the cultural consequences of the availability ran through the next 2 centuries of European thought. The conversations at Careggi, which Lorenzo himself attended whenever his political duties permitted, were the laboratory in which the synthesis was worked out. The women of the Medici household, who do not, on the whole, appear in the philosophical conversations at Careggi, in the historical records that have come down to us, were nonetheless intellectually formidable in their own right, and they ran through their letters and their household management and their patient daily presence in the political life of the family, a parallel kind of operation that the casual reader of the period sometimes misses. Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who has appeared briefly in our story already, was a poet of real accomplishment, whose religious lyrics in the Tuscan vernacular were circulated in manuscript among the literary circles of the city and were considered, by the contemporaries who read them, the equal of much of the more famous male verse of the period. She was also, in addition to her literary work, the principal political advisor to her husband Piero during his years as head of the family, and after his death she continued, until her own death in 1482, as one of Lorenzo's most trusted political confidants. The letters that survive between mother and son, which run to several hundred items in the family archives, show a relationship of unusual intellectual partnership, with Lucrezia advising on marriage negotiations, on the placement of clients in office, on the management of difficult cardinals at the Roman court, on the careful orchestration of the family's appearance at public ceremonies. She was in the deep substantive sense a partner in the political business of the family, and the family in her time did not function without her. Her daughter-in-law, Clarice Orsini, who was in some respects her temperamental opposite, ran the household with a different but equally serious competence, supervising the upbringing of the children, the management of the country estates, the arrangements for the daughters' marriages, and the small daily web of patronage that the female members of a great family conducted on behalf of the female clients who came to them with their needs. The women's correspondence of the period, which has survived in significant quantities for the principal Medici women, is one of the more revealing bodies of evidence about how the family actually operated. The men's letters, which are also extensive, record the formal political and commercial business. The women's letters record the substrate on which the formal business stood, the marriages and the placements and the recommendations and the small gestures of consideration that bound the network of clients to the family, and that, generation after generation, gave the family the reservoir of obligation on which its political position rested. Ficino read the dialogues. The members of the circle discussed them. They argued about the relationship between Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. They worked out, in conversation, the framework that would, in due course, be presented in their books. The members of the circle included, in addition to Ficino and Lorenzo, the poets Cristoforo Landino and Angelo Poliziano, the young philosopher Pico della Mirandola, whose Oration on the Dignity of Man would become one of the founding documents of Renaissance humanism, and the various scholars who passed through Florence in any given year and who were drawn by the magnetism of the Medici circle into the conversations at Careggi. The Botticelli paintings of the period are, in some respects, the visual record of these conversations. The Primavera and the Birth of Venus are paintings that the modern visitor to the Uffizi finds beautiful, but the modern visitor often misses the philosophical content that the original audience would have recognized immediately. The paintings are, in their iconography, complex allegories of Neoplatonic ideas about beauty and love, and the soul's ascent toward the divine. The figures in the paintings, the Venus and the Primavera, and the three Graces and the Mercury and the Zephyrs, are not merely classical decorations. They are the personifications of philosophical concepts that Ficino had been writing about and that Lorenzo and his circle had been discussing, and the paintings are, in their full reading, sophisticated works of philosophical illustration as well as remarkable pieces of visual art. This is the part of the Medici cultural project that the modern visitor most consistently misses, because the philosophical context that gave the paintings their original meaning has by the 21st century been largely lost to general culture. The visitor sees the paintings as beautiful. The visitor is correct that they are beautiful. The visitor does not always see, in addition, the careful intellectual program that was being worked out by the painter and his patron, and the circle of scholars within which both were operating. The program was Neoplatonic philosophy translated into images. The images were, in their day, as much an intellectual achievement as a visual one. The fact that the achievement now reads to the modern eye principally as visual decoration is a measure of how far the philosophical context has receded into the past, and not a measure of any reduction in the achievement itself. Michelangelo, the third great artist of the Medici household, came in as a teenager. He was born in 1475, the son of a minor official in a small town outside Florence. His family was, by Florentine standards, modestly genteel, with some claim to old descent but little money. He was apprenticed at 13 to the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, who ran one of the largest workshops in the city. He showed almost immediately the talent that would mark the rest of his career. He came to the attention of Lorenzo de Medici, who had in the late 1480s established a sculpture garden in the grounds of the convent of San Marco, where promising young artists could study from the antique sculptures that the Medici had been collecting. Lorenzo invited the young Michelangelo to study at the garden. He invited him, shortly afterwards, to live in the Palazzo Medici as a member of the household. The arrangement that Michelangelo had with the Medici household between 1490 and the death of Lorenzo in 1492 was an extraordinary one. He was technically a household member. He had a small room on the second floor of the palazzo. He ate at the family table. He was given new clothes when his old ones wore out. He was, in some respects, a kind of adopted youngest son. with a status that fell somewhere between guest and dependent, and that the family treated with the easy informality that was its general style. He was 15 years old when he moved in. Lorenzo was 40. The relationship between the older patron and the very young artist was, by all accounts, warm. Lorenzo recognized in the boy from the small town an extraordinary talent. He provided the conditions in which the talent could develop. He introduced the boy to the philosophers of the Platonic Academy, who took him to their conversations and who shaped, in the way that mentors shape young men, his understanding of the intellectual world he was now living in. Michelangelo, in old age, would say that the years he had spent in the Medici household had been the formative years of his life. He had absorbed in those years the visual culture of the Medici collection, the antique sculptures in the garden, the modern paintings on the walls of the palazzo, the manuscripts in the library. He had absorbed, in addition, the intellectual culture of the Neoplatonic circle, the philosophical sophistication that would for the rest of his life inform his thinking about his own art. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted 20 years later in Rome, was the work of an artist who had been intellectually formed in the Medici household. The David in marble, sculpted in his middle years for the city of Florence, was the work of the same artist. The architectural innovations of his late career, the dome of St. Peter's and the staircase of the Laurentian Library, were the work of an artist who had grown up surrounded by the Renaissance's most adventurous architectural patronage. The Medici household, in its small private way, had produced by the long, slow, patient cultivation of a teenager who had been brought into it almost as an afterthought, one of the most consequential artists of the entire Western tradition. It is one of the more remarkable returns on investment in the history of cultural patronage. The villas were the countryside of the Medici life, and they deserve their own description because they were, in some respects, where the family was most fully itself. The principal villas were three. The oldest Cafaggiolo was in the Mugello Valley north of Florence, on the lands that the Medici had owned since the family had first emerged from the country into the city in the medieval period. The Cafaggiolo property had been a fortified farmhouse, a kind of small castle, in the early 15th century. Cosimo had rebuilt it, around 1450, into a more comfortable residence, retaining the towers and the crenellations that gave it a defensive appearance, but adding loggias and galleries and the comfortable interior arrangements that a Renaissance family required. The villa stood, and still stands, in a hollow of the Mugello hills, with farmland around it and the small village of Cafaggiolo at its gate. The family used it principally for autumn visits, when the harvest was being brought in, and when the hunting in the surrounding forests was at its best. The second villa, Careggi, was closer to the city, only a few miles outside the walls, on the lower slopes of the hills to the north. Careggi had been a country property of the family since the early 15th century. Cosimo had rebuilt it, again with Michelangelo as architect, into a substantial country house with extensive gardens. Careggi was the philosophical villa, the one in which the Platonic Academy met, in which Ficino did his translating, in which Lorenzo, in his last illness in 1492, was carried out from the city to die in the country air. Careggi was the most intimate of the family's country properties, the one most associated with the intellectual and personal life of the family, rather than with the management of the estates. The third villa, Poggio Acaiano, was Lorenzo's own creation. He acquired the property in 1474 on the slopes of the hills to the west of the city, and he commissioned the architect Giuliano da Sangallo to build him a new villa from the ground up in the latest classical style. The result, completed in the 1480s, was one of the most architecturally innovative buildings of the period, with a grand portico in the manner of an antique temple, a central salon of unusual size, and a careful integration of the building with the surrounding gardens and farmland. The Poggio Villa was the family's modern country house, the one that reflected the intellectual interests of the late 15th century, and that incorporated the architectural lessons that the period had been working out. It was Lorenzo's particular pleasure. He spent, in the last decade of his life, as much time at Poggio as he could spare from his political duties, and the rooms of the villa, when the family was in residence, became the secondary capital of the Medici cultural project. The use of the villas followed a pattern that the family had developed over generations. The summer was the season for Careggi, with its proximity to the city and its philosophical conversations. The autumn was for Cafaggiolo, with the harvest and the hunting. The longer holidays, the Christmas season and the Easter retreats, were for Poggio in Lorenzo's time, and for various other properties as the family acquired them through the late 15th and 16th centuries. The villa life was, in its rhythms, slower and more rural than the city life. The hours of the day were governed less by the demands of the bank and more by the rhythms of the agricultural year. The food, which came from the surrounding estates, was simpler and more directly connected to its sources. The conversation, which took place on the loggias and in the gardens rather than in the formal dining rooms, was more informal and more intellectual. The villa life was, for the family that lived it, a kind of holiday from the more public character of the city palace, and the family treated it, in their use of it, as the more authentic version of their own life. Dustmut. Lorenzo's particular use of Poggio deserves a moment because it captured something about him that the more public records do not always show. He liked, when he was at Poggio, to walk in the gardens early in the morning. He liked to ride out into the fields to inspect the crops with the estate's farm manager. He liked to sit, in the late afternoon, on the loggia of the villa, with a book in his hand, looking out over the rolling hills toward the distant city. He wrote poetry. He wrote, in fact, a considerable quantity of poetry, in the Tuscan vernacular and in the classical Latin that he had been trained in from childhood. The poems are not, by the standards of the great poets of the Italian tradition, first-rate. They are, however, the poems of a man of unusual cultivation, with a real sensitivity to the country he was writing about, and a real ear for the cadences of the Tuscan vernacular. The poems were circulated in his lifetime among the members of his circle. They were published, after his death, in collections that have continued to be read by scholars of the period ever since. They are, in some respects, the most personal trace that Lorenzo left of himself, the small private record of how a 15th century Florentine prince actually thought and felt when the public duties of his position were not pressing on him. Lorenzo himself, in the years of his prime, was the figure around whom the entire Medici project of the late 15th century revolved. We have to spend a moment with him, because he was, by general agreement of contemporaries and historians, an extraordinary person, and the particular flavour of the Medici household in his lifetime was, in significant part, his. He was not, physically, a beautiful man. The portraits of him, including the famous one by Vasari and the various sculptural busts that have survived, show a face that contemporaries described as ugly. He had a long, flat nose, he had a heavy lower jaw, he had a deep voice with a slight nasal quality that the noses of his portraits make easy to imagine. He was, by all accounts, neither tall nor athletic, although he was a competent rider and a capable swordsman in the small ceremonial encounters that his position required. He was not, in the ordinary visual sense, a glamorous figure. What he was instead was charismatic. He had, by the testimony of everyone who met him, a quality of personal presence that the unprepossessing physical features did nothing to diminish. He was witty, he was learned. He was an exceptional conversationalist in 5 or 6 languages. He had the particular Medici quality of being able to listen, with apparent attention, to whatever the person in front of him was saying, even when of him was tedious, and of giving the impression, when he replied, that he had taken the matter seriously. He was, in the deepest sense, a politician. He had inherited the political instincts of his grandfather and his father, and he had developed them, through his own decades of practice, into a personal style that was, by the time he reached his middle years, perhaps the most accomplished political style in Italy. He was also, simultaneously, a poet, a patron, a philosopher, a horseman, a husband, a father, a chief negotiator with 5 Italian states, a banker, a collector of antique gems and cameos, and the host of the most cultured private circle in Europe. He kept all of these activities going simultaneously. He did, by the standards of any single profession of the period, the work of several professions at once. He was, in this respect, the very type of the Renaissance prince, the figure that Burckhardt would describe in the 19th century as the all-round man, l'uomo universale. The type was rare. The actual examples of it, in the period, were perhaps only a handful. Lorenzo was one of them, and he held the position with such apparent ease that the contemporaries who watched him at work had difficulty understanding how he managed it. The marriage to Clarice Orsini, the Roman noblewoman whom his mother had selected for him in 1469, was an arrangement of a particular kind. Clarice was the daughter of one of the great noble families of Rome. The marriage was, in its political logic, the consolidation of the family's relationship with the Roman aristocracy, which was useful to the bank's papal business and to the family's broader political position. Clarice herself was, by all accounts, a serious and rather conservative woman, more conventionally pious than the Medici household's free-flowing culture was used to, and the marriage produced, over the years, a certain tension between the new wife and the established ways of the household. She was particularly suspicious of the Platonic Academy, whose discussions she found theologically dubious. She was uncertain about the easy familiarity with which the family treated the artists and the philosophers who passed through the palazzo. She kept her own counsel. She managed her own household. She bore Lorenzo 10 children over the course of their 23 years of marriage, of whom 7 survived to adulthood. She did her duty in the way that a Renaissance noblewoman of her class did her duty, and the marriage, although not, by the more romantic standards of later periods, a marriage of love, was a marriage of long-working partnership in which the two people involved understood what was expected of them and delivered it. The children of the marriage were the future of the family. The eldest son, Piero, born in 1472, would inherit the position of head of the family on Lorenzo's death. The second son, Giovanni, born in 1475, would become a cardinal at 13, and would, in 1513, become Pope Leo X. The youngest son, Giuliano, born in 1479, would in due course become Duke of Nemours. The daughters were placed in the great Italian families through marriages that consolidated the Medici network across the peninsula. The pattern was the pattern of the great Italian families of the period. The children were in some respects the principal output of the marriage, the next generation of pieces on the Italian political board, and Lorenzo and Clarice raised them with a careful attention to the positions they would, in due course, be required to occupy. The household at the height of Lorenzo's power, in the 1480s, was an extraordinary place to be a guest in. The dinner conversation included Ficino on Plato, Poliziano on Latin poetry, Pico della Mirandola on the philosophical traditions of the East, the visiting humanists from across Europe who had come to Florence specifically to be admitted to the Medici circle, the political agents from the various Italian states who had business with the family, the cardinals from Rome, the foreign ambassadors, the merchants from the bank's foreign branches, and the various artists and architects and craftsmen who were working on Medici projects at any given time. The mixture, on a given evening, was extraordinary. The conversations which moved between Tuscan and Latin and the various foreign languages that the company at the table spoke ranged across the entire intellectual and political life of the late 15th century. The dinners, in their small private way, were one of the principal venues at which the European Renaissance was being thought through. This was the household that we have been walking through tonight. This was the world the kitchen woman was laying her morning fire for, in the kitchen courtyard of 1469, 20 years before the height of Lorenzo's power. The fire she was laying that morning would, in the fullness of the day, contribute to the dinner that would perhaps that evening have at its table some of the principal intellectual figures of the Italian Renaissance. The kitchen woman did not know this. The kitchen woman's job was the fire. The fire was the daily work. The dinner was someone else's department. And then, on a Sunday morning in April 1478, the household nearly came to an end. The event we now call the Pazzi Conspiracy was an attempt by a coalition of the Medici's enemies, organized in significant part by the Pope himself, to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass in the Cathedral of Florence, and to take over the city by force in the immediate aftermath. The conspiracy nearly worked. It failed by a narrow margin. The aftermath of its failure produced one of the most savage rounds of political violence the city had seen in a century, and the consequences of it ran through the next 40 years of Florentine politics in ways that, even now, are not always fully appreciated. The Pazzi family had been one of the great banking families of Florence for generations. They had been allies in earlier decades of the Medici. They had also, increasingly through the 1470s, been rivals. The relationship had deteriorated, in part because of personal frictions, business competition, the political support that the Medici had given to a series of measures that had operated to the Pazzi's commercial disadvantage. By the mid-1470s, the head of the family, Jacopo de' Pazzi, and his nephew Francesco were openly hostile to the Medici regime. The Pope at the time, Sixtus IV, who was Francesco della Rovere by family name, had his own grievances against Lorenzo, who had refused to lend him the money he needed to acquire the lordship of Imola for his nephew. The Pope had, in response, transferred the papal banking account from the Medici to the Pazzi, in a public commercial slap that the Medici had felt deeply. The Pope, the Pazzi, and a small circle of their supporters had, by the winter of 1477, decided that the only solution to the problem the Medici represented was to remove them. The plan was put together over several months. The principal conspirators were Francesco de' Pazzi, his uncle Jacopo de' Pazzi, the Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, who had been blocked by the Medici from taking up his see, the Pope's nephew Girolamo Riario, who had his own ambitions in the region, and the Pope himself, who provided strategic support and approval without committing himself in writing. The plan was to assassinate both Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano, simultaneously, then to use a small armed force to seize the Palazzo della Signoria, then to declare the Medici government overthrown and a new government installed under the joint leadership of the conspirators. The assassination was to take place at a moment when the brothers would be together and unprotected and impossible to defend. The chosen moment was High Mass in the cathedral, on Sunday the 26th of April, 1478. The brothers would be in the cathedral. They would be at the front of the congregation in their family pew. They would be flanked by the conspirators. The signal for the attack would be the elevation of the host, the moment in the Mass when the priest raises the consecrated bread above the altar and the entire congregation kneels and bows its head. At that moment, the assassins would strike. The assassins were two priests who had been engaged for the work because the original assassin who had been engaged, a professional condottiere named Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, had refused to commit murder in a church. The priests were less particular. They positioned themselves behind Lorenzo. Two other men, Francesco de' Pazzi himself and a hired killer named Bernardo Bandini, positioned themselves behind Giuliano. The Mass began. The congregation knelt. The priest elevated the host. The attack on Giuliano was effective. Bandini struck the first blow. Francesco de Pazzi joined in. Giuliano was 25 years old. He died on the floor of the cathedral within a minute or two of the first wound. Francesco de Pazzi, in the frenzy of the attack, also wounded himself in the leg with his own dagger, a detail that the historical record has preserved with the small accidental specificity that contemporary accounts sometimes contain. The attack on Lorenzo was less effective. The two priests struck at his neck, but the wound was glancing rather than fatal. He turned. He drew his sword. He defended himself. Some of his companions who had been at the mass with him came to his aid. He was hustled out of the cathedral, through the sacristy door at the side of the choir, into the small chamber behind, where the door was barred and held against the conspirators who tried to follow. He was wounded, but not gravely. He was taken from the sacristy by a back route through the building to the safety of his palazzo a few minutes' walk away. Giuliano was dead. Lorenzo was alive. The political part of the plan, the seizure of the Signoria and the announcement of the new government, fell apart almost immediately because the conspirators who had been assigned to it found themselves facing a city that was not, as they had assumed, willing to acquiesce. The crowd in the cathedral, when it understood what had happened, turned on the assassins. The crowd in the streets, hearing the news, gathered around the Palazzo della Signoria. The leaders of the city, who had not been part of the conspiracy and who were horrified by it, summoned the city's military forces. Within an hour or two, the conspiracy was visibly failing. What followed was, by even the standards of 15th century Italian political violence, extraordinary. The conspirators were caught, almost all of them, within the day. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, who had attempted to take the Palazzo della Signoria, was captured inside the building. He was hanged, in his ecclesiastical robes, from a window of the palazzo, in full view of the crowd in the square below. Francesco de Pazzi, captured at his own house where he had retreated after wounding himself, was hanged from the same building shortly afterwards. Jacopo de Pazzi, who had attempted to flee the city, was caught at a country inn and brought back. He was hanged. The two priests who had attacked Lorenzo were caught and executed, with the additional ecclesiastical penalty of having their ears and noses cut off before the hanging. Bernardo Bandini, who had killed Giuliano, escaped to Constantinople. The Sultan, who had reasons of his own to wish the Medici well, had him arrested and shipped back to Florence in chains, where he was hanged in 1479, more than a year after the original attack. The hanging was painted by Leonardo da Vinci, who was in Florence at the time and who made a quick sketch of the body as it dangled from the window of the Bargello. The sketch survives. The wider consequences of the conspiracy ran through the following years. The Pope, who had supported the conspiracy, declared war on Florence in revenge for the deaths of his agents. The war lasted 2 years. It was indecisive militarily, but expensive financially. Lorenzo, in a personal diplomatic gamble of considerable courage, travelled to Naples in late 1479 to negotiate directly with the King of Naples, Ferrante, who was the Pope's principal ally in the war. The negotiation succeeded. Naples withdrew from the war. The Pope, deprived of his ally, was forced to make peace. The Florentine state survived. The Medici regime survived. Lorenzo's personal prestige, which had been considerable before the conspiracy, was now enormous, and for the rest of his life he held a position in the city that approached that of a sovereign in everything but name. The grief for Giuliano, however, was real and lasting. He had been 25. He had been Lorenzo's closest companion. He had been beautiful by the testimony of everyone who knew him, with the kind of physical grace that Lorenzo conspicuously lacked. The portraits of Giuliano that survive, in particular the one by Botticelli that was painted shortly before his death, show a face of unusual delicacy and intelligence. Lorenzo, in the years after the assassination, kept the memory of his brother present in the household in various small ways. Giuliano's illegitimate son, Giulio, who had been born just before the assassination, was taken into the household and raised with Lorenzo's own children. Giulio would, in due course, become Pope Clement VII. The dead brother's son would, by the inheritance of the family's accumulated influence, become one of the most powerful men in the world. The line of consequence is one of the strange small details of the period. Lorenzo's own death came in April 1492, 14 years after the conspiracy. He had been ill for some time with a hereditary form of arthritis that had crippled the family for generations, and that his father and grandfather had also suffered from. The illness had progressed in his last years to the point where he could no longer walk without help. He had been taken, in his final illness, out of the city to the villa at Careggi, where the country air was thought to be better for him. He died there on the 8th of April 1492. He was 43 years old. His son Piero, who succeeded him, was 20 years old. Piero had been raised like his brothers and sisters, with every advantage that the Medici household could provide. He had been educated by Poliziano. He had been trained in the management of the bank. He had been introduced to the political machinery of the city. He had, however, by the testimony of contemporaries, none of his father's particular political talent. He was, in the family, considered the least gifted of the three brothers. The middle brother Giovanni, the future Pope Leo, had inherited the family's intellectual sophistication. The youngest, Giuliano, had inherited the family's personal charm. Piero had, more than the other two, inherited the family's name without the family's particular gifts. He was hot-tempered. He was impulsive. He made decisions quickly and without sufficient consultation. He was, in the small daily art of political management that his grandfather and father had perfected, a beginner. The political situation he inherited was, in any case, more difficult than the one his father had inherited. The Italian peninsula in the early 1490s was on the verge of a major political crisis. The French king Charles VIII had inherited a claim, through his Anjou ancestors, to the throne of Naples. He decided in 1494 to enforce the claim by an invasion. The French army of 1494 was the most modern military force in Europe. It included the new bronze artillery that the French had been developing for decades, a kind of weapon that no Italian state was prepared to face. The army marched south through Italy in the autumn of 1494, scattering the Italian armies that opposed it, and approaching the gates of Florence in November. Piero de Medici, faced with a situation of almost unprecedented difficulty, made the wrong decision. He went out, alone and without consultation with the city's council, to negotiate directly with the French king. He agreed in his negotiations to terms that the city considered humiliating, including the surrender of several key fortresses and a substantial payment of money. He returned to the city to find that the council, which had not been consulted, was furious with him. The crowd in the streets, hearing what had happened, was angrier still. Within days, the Medici had been expelled from Florence. The palazzo was seized. The collections were looted. Piero, his brothers, his cousins, and his immediate household fled the city for refuge in the territories of friendly powers. The Medici regime, which had lasted 60 years, was over. The Medici expulsion of 1494 was the first great rupture in the family's history since the temporary exile of Cosimo in 1433. This time, however, the exile would last 18 years, not one. The political situation that had returned Cosimo to the city in 1434 did not repeat itself. The new government of Florence, having ejected the Medici, was not, as the previous Albizzi government had been, a fragile coalition that the absent leader could outmaneuver. It was, instead, something stranger and more powerful. It was a government dominated by a Dominican friar, the prior of the convent of San Marco, a man called Girolamo Savonarola. We have to spend a moment with Savonarola, because the years of his ascendancy in Florence between 1494 and 1498 are one of the most extraordinary episodes in the cultural history of Renaissance Italy, and they shaped the city the Medici would, in due course, return to. Savonarola had come to Florence in 1490. He had been brought, ironically, by Lorenzo himself, on the recommendation of Pico della Mirandola, who had encountered the friar in another Italian city and had been impressed by his preaching. Savonarola was installed at San Marco, the convent that the Medici had rebuilt at Cosimo's expense, and that the family considered, in some respects, their own. He preached, in the small way that a Dominican friar at a Florentine convent preached, and his preaching, at first, was not particularly noticed. By 1492, however, his sermons had begun to draw larger audiences. By 1493, he was preaching in the Cathedral of Florence to crowds that filled the building. By 1494, when the French invasion arrived and the Medici were expelled, he was the most influential single figure in the city, and the new government, when it formed itself in the wake of the Medici departure, took its political direction from him. The content of Savonarola's preaching deserves a careful description, because it was not, in any obvious sense, the preaching of a political revolutionary. It was, instead, the preaching of a religious reformer of the most uncompromising kind. He preached against luxury. He preached against the corruption of the church. He preached against the moral compromises that the wealthy of Florence had, in his view, been making for generations. He preached with particular intensity against the cultural project that the Medici had been sponsoring, which he characterized as a return to pagan ideas under the cover of Christian piety. The Platonic Academy, the classical sculptures in the gardens, the mythological paintings of Botticelli, the philosophical accommodations of Marsilio Ficino, all of these in Savonarola's preaching were evidence of the city's spiritual decay, and the city's only hope of redemption was to repent and to renounce them. And the political program that emerged from this preaching was, by the standards of the late 15th century, radical. The new government of Florence, under Savonarola's spiritual direction, instituted a kind of moral revolution. The sumptuary laws, which had previously been ignored, were enforced. The carnival, which had been a feature of the Florentine year for centuries, was abolished. The art collections of the city, which had been the pride of the previous generation, were now, in the new dispensation, evidence of moral failure that the city was urged to renounce. The famous bonfires of the vanities which the Savonarola regime organized in 1497 and 1498 saw the citizens of Florence bringing their books, their paintings, their cosmetics, their jewelry, their playing cards, and their elaborate clothes to great pyres in the public squares, where they were burned in a public renunciation of the worldly culture that the previous generation had been celebrating. The bonfires were not, on the whole, organized by force. They were organized by enthusiasm. The citizens themselves brought the materials. The flames consumed objects that, by any modern measure of cultural value, would now be priceless. Botticelli, by tradition, brought some of his own paintings to the bonfires. Many other works, both anonymous and famous, were lost in the same way. The Medici, in exile, watched all of this from a distance. The palazzo on the Via Larga had been confiscated by the new government. The collections, although not entirely destroyed, had been substantially dispersed. The library, which had been the pride of the family, had been broken up, with many of its manuscripts going to the public library that the new government had established at San Marco, where some of them remain to this day. The kitchen woman of our framing image, if she had still been alive in 1497, would have seen the Donatello David removed from the courtyard of the palazzo and placed in storage. She would have seen the rooms she had walked through every morning for 30 years cleared of their familiar contents, she would have seen the building she had worked in put to other uses by the new regime. The world she had known, the small, careful daily texture of Medici life, had been, in the space of 3 years, reduced to a memory that the few people still living in the city who could remember it kept to themselves. Savonarola's regime was, however, not durable. The very intensity of the moral program that produced the bonfires of the vanities also produced the political reaction that would, in due course, bring the regime down. The Pope at this point, Alexander VI of the Borgia family, had his own reasons for opposing Savonarola, who had been preaching against papal corruption with particular vigour. The Pope excommunicated him. He continued preaching. The Pope threatened the city of Florence with excommunication if it did not silence him. The city, faced with a choice between its preacher and its commercial standing in Christendom, eventually chose the commercial standing. Savonarola was arrested in April 1498. He was tried for heresy. He was tortured. He confessed, although the confession was extracted under torture and was probably worth as little as such confessions usually were. He was condemned. On the 23rd of May 1498, he and 2 of his closest followers were hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria in front of a crowd that, 4 years earlier, had been receiving his sermons with religious enthusiasm. The historical record contains both crowds, the receiving and the watching. The same individuals in many cases were in both. The Medici did not, despite the fall of Savonarola, return to Florence immediately. The government that took over after the friar's death was a republican government with no particular sympathy for the Medici. It lasted, in various forms, for the next 14 years. The exiled Medici during these years made themselves useful to the various Italian powers in the hope of winning support for an eventual return. They served, in modest capacities, at the courts of friendly princes. They lived, in various places, the lives of distinguished but politically marginal exiles. They waited, in the patient Medici way, for the opportunity to return. The opportunity came, when it came, from a particular configuration of European politics. By 1512, the political situation that had taken the Medici out of Florence had shifted. The French, who had originally invaded in 1494, were now allied against the Pope Julius II, who was struggling to drive them out of Italy. The Pope, in his alliance against France, gave his support to the Medici as a way of changing the government in Florence, which had been French-leaning under the Republican regime. A papal Spanish army, with Medici support, marched on Florence in August 1512. The city, faced with the choice of resisting or submitting, submitted. The Republican government fell. The Medici, after 18 years of exile, came home. The return of 1512 was managed, on the Medici side, principally by Giovanni de Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was now a cardinal of the church and one of the most influential ecclesiastical politicians in Italy. Giovanni was 37 years old in 1512. He had been made a cardinal at 13 at his father's insistence and with the agreement of the then Pope. He had spent the years of exile in Rome, where the family's connections to the church had given him a position from which he could continue to operate even while the family itself was politically displaced. He was by 1512 a substantial figure in his own right, and his return to Florence as the head of the family, although technically the head was his older brother Piero, who had died in exile in 1503, was the return of a man who was already, before the return, one of the major figures of European politics. Giovanni did not stay in Florence. He returned briefly. He arranged the new political settlement. He delegated the management of the city to his cousin Giulio, the illegitimate son of Giuliano de Medici, who had been raised in Lorenzo's household after his father's death in the Pazzi conspiracy. Giulio, who had been recognized as legitimate through papal dispensation, and who was by 1512 also a cardinal, took over the practical direction of affairs in Florence. Giovanni returned to Rome, where in March 1513, 6 months after the family's return to power in their home city, he was elected pope. He took the name Leo X. The election of Leo X was the moment at which the Medici project reached, by some measures, its absolute zenith. The family that had been a careful Florentine banking dynasty in the time of Giovanni de Medici had now produced a pope. The bank that had in its previous generation lost the papal account to the rival Pazzi family was now, through the simple fact that the pope was a Medici, restored to its central position in the financial life of the church. The city of Florence, which had expelled the family less than 20 years earlier, was now governed by another Medici cardinal who would, in due course, also become pope. The trajectory was, by any historical measure, remarkable. From the careful banker of 1400, in 3 generations, the family had risen to occupy the highest office in Western Christendom. Leo X was, in his particular style, the most flamboyant of all the Medici popes. He had inherited from his father the cultural sophistication and the personal charm that had made Lorenzo such an effective political figure. He had inherited also, however, none of his father's careful financial discipline. He spent on artistic patronage, on architectural projects, on the elaborate court ceremonies that he believed the dignity of the papal office required. He spent on the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which had been begun by his predecessor Julius II, and which Leo continued with enthusiasm. He spent on the works he commissioned from Raphael, who became, under Leo, the principal artist of the papal court. He spent on the commissions he placed with Michelangelo, who was now an artist of established reputation. He spent on the elaborate hunting parties that he conducted in the country estates around Rome, on the banquets in the Vatican that became famous for their lavishness, on the patronage of poets and scholars and musicians who flocked to his court. The spending exceeded the income. The papal finances, never robust, deteriorated badly during Leo's reign. The Pope responded, in part, by selling indulgences on a scale and by methods that had not previously been used. The indulgences sold for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, in particular, were marketed throughout Europe with an aggressiveness that scandalized the more serious reformers within the church. One of the more serious reformers was a German Augustinian friar named Martin Luther, who in October 1517 nailed a list of 95 theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, protesting against, among other things, the sale of the St. Peter's indulgences. The protest, which Leo at first dismissed as a small German theological dispute, would in the next decade become the founding event of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation would, in turn, fracture Western Christendom in ways that would never be repaired. The Medici Pope, in his pursuit of artistic glory, had inadvertently triggered the religious revolution that would shape the next 4 centuries of European history. Leo X died in December 1521, at the age of 46. He had been pope for 8 years. His successor, Hadrian VI, a Dutch reformer of austere habits, lasted only 20 months. The conclave of 1523 elected, after a long deadlock, the Medici cardinal Giulio, the cousin who had been managing Florence. He took the name Clement VII. Clement VII's reign was, in some respects, the catastrophe of the Medici cultural project. He was a competent administrator. He was a man of considerable personal cultivation. He was, by the testimony of those who knew him, a serious and even rather melancholy figure, lacking entirely the personal flamboyance of his cousin Leo. He inherited, however, a political situation of extraordinary difficulty, and the decisions he took to manage it produced, in 1527, one of the most dramatic events in the history of Renaissance Italy. The situation was this. The 2 great powers of European politics in the 1520s were the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who controlled Spain and the Netherlands and the Habsburg lands of Central Europe and large parts of southern Italy, and the King of France, Francis I, who controlled France and parts of northern Italy. The two were at war for most of the decade. The Pope, who controlled the Papal States in central Italy, was pulled in both directions. Clement VII, in 1525, made the strategic decision to ally himself with France against the Emperor. The decision in its political logic was understandable. France was the closer power. France had the more obvious interest in keeping the Pope's territories independent of imperial control. The decision, however, in its execution, proved to be a disaster. Charles V, faced with a hostile Pope at his rear, while he was trying to consolidate his position in northern Italy, decided to deal with the problem definitively. In May 1527, an imperial army, mostly composed of unpaid German mercenaries with a strong Lutheran sympathy, descended on Rome. The army had not been ordered to sack the city, but its commander, who had died in the initial assault, was not in a position to control what happened next. The unpaid soldiers, finding themselves inside the wealthiest city in Christendom with no commander to restrain them, did what unpaid soldiers in such circumstances had always done. They sacked it. The sack of Rome, which began on the 6th of May 1527 and continued with diminishing intensity for several months, was the most devastating event to befall the city since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The churches were looted. The palaces were burned. The artistic treasures of the previous 50 years of papal patronage were destroyed or dispersed. The population of the city, which had reached perhaps 55,000 at its peak in the early 1520s, was reduced by perhaps half through deaths, flight, and the simple disappearance of people whose fates were never afterwards recorded. The Pope himself, who had taken refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, the great fortified building that overlooked the Tiber, was effectively a prisoner there for 7 months while the sack continued around him. He emerged, when he finally did emerge, a broken man. The Rome of the High Renaissance, which the previous 2 generations of papal patronage had built, was, in the space of a few months, comprehensively destroyed. The cultural consequences of the sack were profound. The court of Leo X, which had been the principal centre of Renaissance cultural production in the 1510s, ceased to exist. The artists, the scholars, the architects, the musicians who had gathered there scattered. Many of them returned to their cities of origin. Some emigrated to other European courts. Some died in the sack itself. The momentum that had built up over 4 decades of papal cultural patronage was, in the space of a year, shattered. The artistic style that emerged from the wreckage, which historians now call mannerism, was a different, and in some respects darker style, and the cultural confidence of the Italian Renaissance, which had been one of its defining features, never fully recovered from the trauma of 1527. The Medici themselves had also, simultaneously, been expelled from Florence again. The shock of the sack of Rome and the apparent destruction of the papacy had emboldened the Republican faction in Florence to rise once more. In May 1527, the same month as the sack, the Medici were driven out of the city for the second time. They returned in 1530 after a long and difficult military campaign that involved imperial troops besieging the city for nearly a year. Florence surrendered in August 1530. The Medici came back. This time, however, they came back not as private citizens, but as rulers in formal title. Clement VII, in his final years as Pope, arranged for his nephew Alessandro de Medici to be appointed Duke of Florence by imperial decree. The Republic, which had survived in formal terms even through the long Medici dominance of the 15th century, was abolished. Florence became a duchy. The Medici, after 130 years of careful private power, were now formally and explicitly princes. Clement VII died in 1534. He had been a melancholy figure to the end. The decisions he had made had produced, in his lifetime, the destruction of the Roman court that the previous generation had built, and the transformation of his family from quiet republican leaders into formal hereditary princes of a small Italian state. The transformation was not, in his own assessment, an unalloyed success. He had wanted, by the testimony of those who knew him, a different outcome. He had got the outcome that history had given him. The new Duke of Florence, Alessandro, was an unsatisfactory figure who lasted only 7 years before being assassinated by a relative in 1537. The succession passed, in the absence of any other plausible candidate, to a distant cousin from a junior branch of the family, an 18-year-old named Cosimo, who would, over the next 37 years, become the most consequential ruler the Medici dynasty would ever produce, and who would, in the process, transform Florence from the wreckage of the early 16th century into a stable and prosperous regional state that would last, in modified form, for another 2 centuries. Cosimo, when he came to the dukedom in 1537, was not the obvious choice. He was a younger member of a junior branch of the family. He had been raised on his father's death some years earlier in the modest country house of his mother, Maria Salviati, who was a daughter of Lucrezia de Medici, and therefore connected to the senior line through the female descent. He had been educated, but not lavishly. He had been trained in arms and in basic letters. He had not, by any of the contemporary observers who described him in his teens, given any particular sign of remarkable ability. He was, when the Senate of Florence elected him duke at the age of 17, the candidate of compromise that the various factions within the city could agree on the assumption that a young man of his particular background would be easy to manage. He turned out, in office, to have inherited from somewhere the deep, careful political instinct that had characterized the senior branch of the family. He used the first months of his dukedom to consolidate his position against the various factions that had supported him, replacing their men with his own, eliminating the more ambitious of them by various methods, and establishing a pattern of personal control that would, over the next decades, transform the dukedom from a patched-together compromise into a coherent, absolutist state. He was, in his political style, the antithesis of the older Medici tradition. The older tradition had operated by careful private management of a republican constitution. Cosimo operated by formal direct rule. He took the formal title. He imposed the formal taxes. He commanded the formal armed forces. He built, slowly through the 1540s and 1550s, the apparatus of a modern centralizing state, with a regular tax system, a standing army, a unified law code, and a permanent administrative bureaucracy that the Medici state of the previous century had never possessed. And stay here, the transformation of Florence under Cosimo was, in many respects, the deepest of all the transformations the city went through during the Medici period. The city in 1537, when he came to power, was still in significant respects the city of the previous century. It was still a commercial republic in its underlying structures, even if the formal title had been changed to a dukedom. The city in 1574, when he died, was something quite different. It was the capital of a regional state, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, that controlled most of the territory of modern Tuscany. It had a court. It had the regular institutions of a princely government. It had a standing diplomatic service with permanent ambassadors at the major European courts. It had, most visibly, a new ducal palace, the Palazzo Vecchio, which Cosimo had taken over as his official residence, and decorated with a program of frescoes by Vasari, celebrating the family's accumulated achievements. It had the Uffizi, the new administrative complex on the Arno that Cosimo had commissioned and that Vasari had designed, which housed the various offices of the new government in a single coherent building. And it had, on the other side of the river, the Palazzo Pitti, which Cosimo had bought from the Pitti family in 1549, and which had become, after extensive renovation, the principal residence of the ducal family. The Palazzo Pitti deserves a moment because it represents the new style of Medici domesticity that the 17th century would inherit. The original Palazzo Medici on the Via Larga, where we have spent so much of this evening, was a Renaissance palazzo of the older type, large but not enormous, urban but not isolated, integrated into the streetscape of the city. The Palazzo Pitti was something else. It was a vast block of stone 4 stories high and wider than any private building in Florence had ever been, set on a slope above the river with a great garden, the Boboli. Behind it, the Boboli Gardens, which Cosimo and Eleonora began to lay out in the 1550s, and which successive generations of Grand Dukes extended and elaborated for the next 2 centuries, were one of the great achievements of European garden design, and they deserve a moment of their own, because the gardens were, in some respects, the part of the new ducal palace that the family inhabited most fully. The slope behind the Pitti Palace rises steeply toward the south, and the gardens that the Medici designers laid out on it were terraced into the slope in a sequence of levels that each opened from the level above into a different kind of garden experience. The lowest level, immediately behind the palace, was a great amphitheatre of grass, surrounded by hedges of clipped laurel, used for the elaborate court entertainments that the dukes staged for state visits and family weddings. The level above held the formal parterres, with their geometric beds and their statuary placed at the intersections of the paths. Higher up, beyond the formal sections, were the wilder areas, the small woodland plantings of holm oak and stone pine, in which the family installed grottos and fountains, and the small architectural follies that the 17th century taste called for. At the very top, at the highest point of the slope, was a terrace from which the visitor could look out over the entire city of Florence below, with the dome of the cathedral and the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio rising from the rooftops, and the Arno running through the centre, and the hills on the far side green with the country properties of the city's wealthy. The gardens were used in different ways at different hours of the day. In the early morning, the family walked in them for exercise. In the middle of the day, in the heat of the Tuscan summer, the family retreated to the shaded grottos, where the small fountains kept the air cool. In the evenings, the gardens were lit with torches and used for the small private suppers and the larger formal receptions that the court calendar required. The gardens were also, for the household servants who maintained them, a major operation in their own right. Dozens of gardeners worked in them daily. The plants were brought in many cases from the family's other estates, and the rare specimens, which the family acquired from across the Mediterranean and beyond, were tended by specialists who had been trained for the purpose. The gardens were, in their way, as much a Medici cultural achievement as the painting collections in the palace, and the visitor who walks through them today, 3 centuries after the dynasty ended, is walking through one of the longest maintained continuous works of garden art in the European tradition. It was, in its scale and its arrangement, a princely palace rather than a private house. It had been begun, in the previous century, by a member of the Pitti family who had wanted to outdo the Medici in the size of his residence, and who had, in the process of trying, bankrupted himself. The unfinished palace had stood for decades as an empty shell on the slope above the Arno. Cosimo bought it. He completed it. He moved his family into it. The transformation from Renaissance merchant prince to princely ruler was given in the move from the Via Larga to the Boboli. Its full architectural expression, Cosimo's marriage was to Eleonora di Toledo, the daughter of the Spanish viceroy of Naples, a connection that gave him the support of the Spanish imperial system that dominated Italy in the 16th century, and that allowed him to rule his small state with a degree of external legitimacy that internal politics alone could not have provided. Eleonora was, by all accounts, a serious and competent woman, a careful manager of the household, a devoted mother, and a significant political advisor to her husband. She bore him 11 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. She died in 1562 of malaria on a trip to the family's coastal estates and Cosimo, who had been deeply attached to her, never fully recovered from the loss. The portraits of Eleonora that Bronzino painted, including the famous one in which she sits with her young son Giovanni in a dress of figured silk that has become one of the most studied garments in the history of fashion, are among the most arresting images of a 16th century princess that any court of the period produced. The dress in the Bronzino portrait, with its pomegranate pattern in heavy gold thread brocade, is now thought to be the actual dress in which Eleonora was buried, and the conservation work on her grave clothes in the 20th century confirmed that the painted dress and the buried dress were the same. The detail is one of the small chains of evidence by which the daily reality of 16th century princely life can still, occasionally, be touched. Cosimo's later years were marked by a gradual withdrawal from active rule, which he transferred increasingly to his eldest surviving son, Francesco. He died in 1574, after a long retirement, having transformed a dukedom and given it the institutional shape that would carry it through the next 2 centuries. He was succeeded by Francesco, who was succeeded by his brother Ferdinando, who had given up his cardinal's hat to take the throne, and the line of Grand Dukes continued generation by generation into the 17th and 18th centuries. The story of the Medici from this point is a story of formal princely rule in a small but prosperous state, with the cultural and political dramas of the earlier period largely replaced by the routine business of dynastic governance. But this is not quite the whole story. 2 of the most consequential Medici lives of the 16th and 17th centuries unfolded not in Florence but in France, where 2 daughters of the family, in successive generations, became queens of France through marriage to French kings. Their stories are part of the larger Medici story, and we have to give them a moment. Caterina de Medici, who became Catherine de Medicis when she crossed the Alps and married into the French royal family, was the granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent's son Piero, the same Piero who had been expelled from Florence in 1494. She was born in 1519 in Florence, into a family that had been restored to power, but that was about to enter the long crisis of Pope Clement VII and the sack of Rome and the second expulsion. Her parents both died of illness when she was a baby. She was raised by various relatives in various houses through the turbulent years of the late 1520s. During the second expulsion of the Medici from Florence between 1527 and 1530, she was held as a hostage in a Florentine convent. She was 9 years old. The Republican faction that had taken over the city debated at one point what to do with her, with various members of the council suggesting various measures, including some that would have made her future irrelevant to history. The decision was eventually taken to leave her in the convent. She emerged, when the city was retaken in 1530, alive but with a memory of confinement and political danger that would, by the testimony of later observers, mark the rest of her life. She was married in 1533, at the age of 14, to Henri, the second son of King Francis I of France. The marriage had been arranged by her uncle Pope Clement VII as part of his broader strategy of allying the family with France. The wedding was held in Marseille. The Pope himself officiated. The bride was a Florentine merchant's daughter, although a Medici. The groom was a French royal prince. The match was, by the standards of European royal marriages of the period, slightly unequal in social terms, and Caterina, in her early years at the French court, suffered from the small daily condescensions of a court that considered her an Italian merchant's daughter who had been imposed on them by political necessity. Her position became more difficult, however, when her husband's elder brother, the Dauphin, died in 1536. Henri now became the heir to the throne. Caterina was now the future Queen of France. The expectation that came with the position, the expectation of producing heirs, weighed on her. For the first 10 years of her marriage, she failed to produce children. The court watched. The court whispered. There were periodic suggestions that the marriage should be annulled and that the Dauphin should be married to someone more reliably fertile. Caterina, by all accounts, lived these years in a state of considerable private distress. She consulted physicians. She undertook various treatments, some of them medically reasonable by the standards of the period, others verging on the magical. She prayed. She waited. The first child finally arrived in 1544. After that, the births came regularly. She bore 10 children in 12 years, of whom 7 survived infancy, including 3 sons who would all in succession become kings of France. The fertility crisis was over. The political crisis, however, was about to begin. Henry became king in 1547, on the death of his father. He reigned as Henri II for 12 years. He died in 1559 after a freak accident in a tournament held to celebrate the marriage of one of his daughters, in which a splinter from a broken lance entered his eye. The wound was infected. The infection killed him within days. Caterina, who had been queen for 12 years, was now a widow at the age of 40. She emerged, in the years after Henri's death, as the central political figure of the French court for the next 30 years. Her son Francis II, who succeeded his father, lasted only 18 months before dying of an ear infection. Her son Charles IX, who succeeded him, was a child of 10 when he came to the throne. Caterina became regent. She held effective power in France for the rest of her life, through the reigns of 3 of her sons, and the period of her dominance was the period in which France went through the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants that would, before they were over, kill perhaps 3 million people and shape the country for generations. The most notorious episode of Caterina's regency was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 1572, in which several thousand French Protestants were killed in a single night of coordinated violence in Paris and other French cities. The massacre had been authorized in some form by the King and the Queen Mother. The exact nature of the authorization, and the question of whether it was supposed to extend to a general massacre or only to the targeted killing of a few Protestant leaders, has been debated by historians for centuries. The reputation that Caterina acquired in the aftermath of a ruthless Italian schemer who had brought the methods of the Medici to the French court was partly accurate and partly the product of subsequent Protestant propaganda. She was, by the standards of the period, a competent and pragmatic ruler in extremely difficult circumstances. She was also, by any standards, willing to use violence when violence served her purposes. The two judgments are not incompatible. They are, in some respects, the unavoidable judgments of any Renaissance ruler operating in conditions of religious civil war. Caterina died in 1589, at the age of 69. She had outlived her husband, all but one of her children, and most of the political associates with whom she had begun her career. She had presided over France through some of the most difficult decades of its history. She had introduced into the French court various Italian customs that had in due course been absorbed into French aristocratic culture. The fork, as a piece of dining equipment, had been popularized at the French court partly by her influence. The art of perfume, the fashion of high heels, the elaborate side saddle riding for ladies, all owed something to the Italian customs she had brought with her. Her cultural patronage, in the periods when the political situation allowed her to attend to it, was extensive. She built, she collected, she supported artists and writers. The Tuileries Palace in Paris, which stood until the late 19th century when it was destroyed in the Commune, was her commission. The personal style she brought to the French court, which combined the Italian sophistication of her Florentine upbringing with the political seriousness of a queen mother managing a divided kingdom, would shape the manners of the French aristocracy for generations. Her direct line did not, however, survive her by long. Her sons, 3 of whom became kings, died without legitimate male heirs. Her last surviving son, Henri III, was assassinated in 1589, 4 months after her own death. The throne of France passed, after his death, to a distant cousin, Henri of Navarre, who became Henri IV, and who founded the new dynasty of the Bourbons. The Medici descent of the French royal family ended in the male line with Henri III's death. The female line, however, would, in due course, contribute another Medici queen, this time from Florence directly, to the same dynasty. Maria de Medici, who became Marie de Medicis after her own marriage to Henri IV in 1600, was the great-granddaughter of Cosimo I. She was 26 years old when she married. The marriage had been arranged, like Caterina's 7 decades earlier, as a piece of high politics, in which the bankrupt French king needed money and the Medici Grand Duke needed political alliance, and the agreement that brought Maria to France involved a substantial dowry that the Medici provided, in part by writing off a large existing debt that the French crown owed to the Medici Bank. The marriage was difficult. Henri IV was a man of extraordinary energy and considerable personal charm, but he was also famously unfaithful, and his court included a permanent presence of acknowledged mistresses whose existence Maria, as queen, was expected to tolerate. She tolerated them with poor grace. The marriage produced 6 children, including the future Louis XIII. It also produced years of mutual tension, scenes of public disagreement, and the kind of diplomatic strain that affected, periodically, the relationship between France and Tuscany. Henri was assassinated in May 1610 in a Paris street by a fanatical Catholic who had become convinced that the king's policies were favouring Protestants. Maria, like Caterina before her, became regent for her young son, who was 9 years old at his father's death. She held the regency until 1617, when her son, by now an adult, took control of the government in a kind of palace coup that included the assassination of Maria's principal political advisor, the Italian Concino Concini, who had been, by general agreement, the most unpopular man in France. Maria was banished from court. She was eventually allowed to return. She was banished again. She fled France in the early 1630s. Richest died in exile in Cologne in 1642 in considerably reduced circumstances. Her cultural legacy, however, was substantial. She had commissioned, during her years of effective power, a series of paintings from Peter Paul Rubens depicting the events of her own life in 24 enormous canvases that hung, originally, in the Luxembourg Palace in Paris that she had built. The Rubens cycle, as it is known, is one of the most ambitious pieces of dynastic propaganda in the history of European painting. It hangs now in the Louvre, where the visitor can walk along it and see, in the elaborate Baroque allegorical compositions that Rubens produced, the entire arc of Maria's life translated into the visual language of 17th century court culture. The cycle is the kind of thing that only the wealthiest patron of the period could have commissioned, and the period, in the years of Maria's regency, was Maria. The fact that the cycle survives, and that it survives in a public museum in the heart of Paris, is one of the more remarkable cultural legacies of the Medici, outside Florence itself. But while the Medici daughters were going abroad to become queens of France, the senior line in Florence was, slowly through the 17th century, declining. The Grand Dukes of the 17th century were not, on the whole, men of the calibre of Cosimo I. Ferdinando I, who succeeded his brother Francesco in 1587, was a competent ruler and major patron of culture. He maintained the duchy in good order. He developed the port of Livorno into a free port that became, over the course of his reign, one of the most important commercial harbours in the Mediterranean. He was, in his administrative care, the worthy continuator of his father's project. His successors, however, became progressively less effective. Cosimo II, who reigned from 1609 to 1621, was a man of cultivated tastes and limited political energy. He is remembered principally for his patronage of Galileo Galilei, who had been one of his tutors and who, on his accession, was appointed to a position at the Florentine court that allowed him the leisure to pursue the astronomical research that would in due course produce the great works on which his subsequent reputation rests. Galileo named the moons of Jupiter, when he discovered them in 1610, the Medicean stars, in honour of his patron. The naming did not stick. The moons are now known by mythological names that have nothing to do with the family. But the patronage that allowed the discoveries to be made was real, and the contribution that the Medici made through this patronage to the early scientific revolution was substantial. The shape of the patronage, in the years it operated, deserves a moment of description because it tells us something about how the Medici cultural project had evolved by the early 17th century. Galileo, when he came back to Florence in 1610 to take up the position the Grand Duke had offered him, was given a salary, lodgings in the city when he wanted them, the use of a small villa in the hills above the city when he preferred the country air, and most importantly, the formal title of philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke, which was a position with no specific duties and which existed, in effect, to give him the leisure to pursue his own research. The arrangement was the same arrangement, in its underlying logic, that Cosimo the Elder had made with Donatello in the 15th century. The artist or the scientist was supported. The support was not, in any formal sense, employment. The work that the artist or the scientist produced under the support belonged, by the conventions of the time, to the world rather than to the patron. The patron's reward was the prestige of having been the patron, and the small share in the cultural achievement that the prestige conferred. The Medici, in supporting Galileo, were not in any direct sense funding particular discoveries. They were funding more loosely the existence of a particular kind of intellectual life that the period had come to consider valuable, and they were doing so because they considered themselves, as the family had considered itself for 2 centuries, the people whose responsibility it was to fund such things. The fact that Galileo, in due course, ran into difficulty with the Roman Inquisition over the heliocentric hypothesis, and that the Medici, in those difficulties, gave him only limited public support, because they were not in a position to defy the Church openly, was one of the small disappointments of the patronage. But the years before the difficulties, in which Galileo had produced the work on the satellites of Jupiter and the phases of Venus and the mountains of the Moon, had been years that the Medici support had made possible, and the work itself, which has lasted to become one of the foundations of modern astronomy, is in some measure the long-term return on the investment that Cosimo II made when he brought his old tutor home to Florence in 1610. The Medici were not, by the 17th century, the central commercial and political force in Italy that they had been 2 centuries earlier. They were, however, still capable of recognizing a remarkable mind when one came to their attention, and of providing the small, steady support that allowed the remarkable mind to do its work. The capacity for that recognition was, in some respects, the deepest of all the family's accumulated cultural skills, and the fact that they exercised it in their decline, as well as in their rise, is one of the things that the long retrospect of 3 centuries makes worth noticing. Ferdinando II, who reigned from 1621 to 1670, was a careful and modest ruler whose reign coincided with the long economic decline of Italy that the 17th century brought to the entire peninsula. The Italian states, which had been the financial and commercial centre of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, were progressively displaced by the new commercial powers of the Atlantic, the Dutch, the English, the French. The Medici Bank had ceased to operate as a coherent international institution by the end of the 16th century. The wealth of the family was now, increasingly, the static wealth of a small princely dynasty rather than the dynamic wealth of a great commercial family. The 17th century Medici Grand Dukes lived in many respects on the accumulated capital of the previous 2 centuries, and the accumulated capital, although still considerable, was no longer growing. Cosimo III, who reigned from 1670 to 1723, was the longest reigning of the Medici Grand Dukes. He was also, by general agreement of historians, one of the least successful. He was personally pious to the point of obsession. He imposed on the duchy an increasingly severe set of moral and religious laws that drove out a significant part of the duchy's productive population. He was a poor financial manager. He spent heavily on religious foundations and on the elaborate court ceremonies that he believed his dignity required. The duchy, under his rule, became progressively poorer, more depopulated, and less politically significant. The Medici state, which had been one of the major regional powers of Italy in the 16th century, was now, by the early 18th century, a small and impoverished principality that the great European powers, France and Austria and Spain, treated with the condescension reserved for the secondary states of the time. Cosimo III had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, Ferdinando, was a man of considerable cultivation, a notable patron of music, who introduced the new pianoforte invented by Bartolomeo Cristofori at the Medici court. He was also, however, a man of considerable personal disorder, whose private life produced a series of scandals that his pious father deplored, and who, in any case, died of disease in 1713 before his father, leaving no legitimate heirs. The second son, Gian Gastone, who would in due course become the last Grand Duke, was a melancholy and reclusive figure who had been forced, in his younger years, into a disastrous marriage to a German heiress whom he could not stand and from whom he had eventually separated. He had no children either. The dynasty was, by the early 18th century, looking at its own extinction. The daughter, however, was a different matter. Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, born in 1667, was a woman of considerable ability and remarkable strength of character, and the long final chapter of the Medici story is, in significant respects, hers. Anna Maria Luisa was married at the age of 23 to the Elector Palatine Johann Wilhelm in 1691. The marriage was a successful one by the standards of dynastic marriages of the period. The two were genuinely fond of each other. They lived in the electoral capital of Dusseldorf. They had no children, despite trying. They collected art together. They built up, through purchases across Europe, one of the most important private collections of paintings of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, with works by Rubens and Rembrandt and the other major figures of the Northern Baroque. The Elector died in 1716, after 25 years of marriage, leaving Anna Maria Luisa a widow at the age of 49. She returned to Florence, where her father was still on the throne, and where her brother Gian Gastone would shortly succeed him. She returned, however, to a particular situation. Her brother had no heirs. The dynasty was, on its current trajectory, going to end. The European powers had already, in the diplomacy of the early 18th century, agreed among themselves that the duchy, on the extinction of the Medici line, would pass to a foreign prince. The candidate eventually agreed on was Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who was the husband of Maria Theresa of Austria and the future Holy Roman Emperor. Francis Stephen would inherit the duchy. The Medici, after 3 centuries, would be replaced as rulers of Florence. Anna Maria Luisa, in her last decade, set about ensuring that the cultural inheritance of the family would not, on the change of dynasty, be removed from the city. The collections of the Medici, which had been built up over 15 generations, were, by the early 18th century, the most extensive private collections of art and antiquities in Europe. They included the Donatello David, the Botticelli paintings, the Michelangelo sculptures, the antique gems and cameos that the family had been collecting since Cosimo I, the libraries that Cosimo the Elder had begun, the porcelain, and the silver, and the furniture, and the tapestries, and the entire accumulated material culture of 3 centuries of patronage. There was a real possibility, on the change of dynasty, that the new ruler, Francis Stephen, would either remove the collections to Vienna or sell them off piecemeal to fund his other interests. Anna Maria Luisa, in 1737, signed an agreement with the new Lorraine dynasty that has come to be known as the Patto di Famiglia, the family pact. By the terms of the pact, she ceded her own personal claims on the family inheritance to the new dynasty, but she did so on the condition that the entire collection, the paintings and the sculptures and the antiquities and the libraries and everything else of cultural value that the family had accumulated, must remain in Florence in perpetuity, available for the public benefit, and never to be removed from the city, or sold, or dispersed. The new dynasty, which had no particular interest in the cultural inheritance for its own sake, but which was prepared to agree to the condition in exchange for clearing up the legal questions about the dynastic transition, signed the agreement. The Patto di Famiglia is one of the most consequential cultural agreements in the history of European art. It is the reason that the Uffizi, which Cosimo I had built as an administrative complex, became in the 18th century one of the great public museums of Europe, displaying the Medici collections in the building that had originally housed the Medici offices. It is the reason that the Pitti Palace still contains the family's collection of paintings. It is the reason that the Laurentian Library, which Cosimo the Elder had founded, and which Lorenzo had expanded, and which Michelangelo had designed the staircase for, still holds the manuscripts that the family had been collecting since the 15th century. It is the reason that the visitor to Florence today can walk through rooms full of art that the same family commissioned, paid for, lived among, and finally, by the act of one old woman in 1737, made permanently available to the public. Anna Maria Luisa's signature on the Patto di Famiglia was, in some respects, the final great act of Medici patronage. She left, by signing it, the entire accumulated culture of the family to the city that the family had ruled for 300 years. Her brother Gian Gastone died in 1737, the same year. Anna Maria Luisa took up residence in the Pitti Palace, in the apartments she had occupied when she had returned to Florence after her widowhood. She was the last surviving Medici. She was 70 years old. She lived for 6 more years. Those last 6 years were spent in the Pitti Palace, surrounded by the collections that her agreement had saved, with a small household of servants, and the small daily routines of an old widow who has outlived everyone she grew up with. She received occasional visitors, the foreign nobles and scholars who came to Florence on the early Grand Tour, and who paid their respects to the last representative of the family that had once ruled the city. She attended Mass daily in the chapel of the palace. She walked, when her health permitted, in the Boboli gardens that climbed up the slope behind the building. She sat, in the long Tuscan summer afternoons, on the loggia of her apartments, looking out over the city that she would, when she died, leave to its new rulers, but whose accumulated culture she had, by her agreement, secured. She died on the 18th of February 1743, in the Pitti Palace, of a respiratory infection. She was 75 years old. She was buried in the family chapel at San Lorenzo, in the great mausoleum that her grandfather Ferdinando II had begun, and that had been the burial place of every Grand Duke since. She was the last to be buried there. The chapel, which is one of the most spectacular pieces of 17th century funerary architecture in Italy, with its walls of inlaid marble and its great dome above the family tombs, became, with her interment, a closed book. The dynasty was over. The bones of all of its principal figures, from the early dukes to the last Grand Duchess, were now in their final resting places. The new dynasty, which would rule Tuscany for the next century until the unification of Italy in 1861, would have its own arrangements for its own dead. Let us come back now to the morning we began with. The kitchen woman, Lucrezia, who had been laying her fire in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici on a summer dawn in 1469, lived a long life by the standards of 15th century Florence. She left the household as her own marriage came due in the early 1480s to marry a small craftsman from a neighbouring street. She had children. She raised them. She continued occasionally to come back to the palazzo to visit the women she had worked alongside, who told her the news of the household, the births and the deaths and the political dramas that were happening upstairs. She lived to see, although she did not understand at the time what she was seeing, the funeral procession of Lorenzo de Medici in 1492. She lived to see briefly the expulsion of the family in 1494, when the palazzo she had laid her fires in for 15 years was sacked by the new regime. She did not live to see the Medici return in 1512. She died of unknown causes sometime in the 1490s in the small house in a back street of the same neighbourhood where she had spent her working life. Her name does not appear in any history book. The kitchen records of the palazzo, in which her wages were entered each month, were lost in one of the various reorganizations of the family archives in the 17th century. She is, in the strict sense, anonymous, but the fire she laid that morning, on a particular dawn in 1469, did its work. The kettle boiled. The water in it was used to brew the morning drinks for the family. The family, fortified, came down to its breakfast. The day proceeded. The dinners were eaten. The conversations were had. The artists were paid. The collections were assembled. The Pope, 2 generations later, was elected. The Queen of France in the next generation after that took her place at the French court. The Grand Duchy was established. The dynasty rose, peaked, declined, and ended, and the building she had laid her fires in, the Palazzo Medici on the Via Larga, still stood when the dynasty ended, and still stands now, and the visitor who walks through its courtyard today is walking through the same courtyard she walked through every morning for 15 years to fetch her water. The woman who closes the long story is not, of course, the same woman. The woman who closes the long story is Anna Maria Luisa, who in February 1743 was lying in her bedchamber in the Pitti Palace, with the priests in attendance, with the servants moving quietly through the rooms outside, with the news of her decline already travelling through the city and the country, and more slowly to the various foreign courts where the diplomatic services were waiting to report her death. She had been, in her own way, a patient and quiet woman in the Medici tradition. She had outlived, by 1743, almost everyone she had grown up with. She had outlived her husband by 27 years. She had outlived her brother Ferdinando by 30 years. She had outlived her father by 20 years. She had outlived her younger brother, the last Grand Duke, by 6. She had outlived the Medici Bank by 150 years. She had outlived the Medici Republic by 240. She had outlived, by the strict accounting of historical time, the Renaissance itself, which historians by the 18th century already considered a closed period of the past. She had spent her last 6 years in the apartments of the Pitti Palace, surrounded by the inherited objects of a family that had been for 3 centuries the principal collectors of art in Italy. She had lived in those 6 years in the careful, quiet way that the Medici women had always lived, with her small daily routines, and her religious observances, and her occasional visits, and her long afternoons on the loggia in the summer heat. She had thought, in the long afternoons, about what she remembered. She remembered her childhood in Florence, in the late 17th century, when her father had been Grand Duke, and the court had still, although in reduced form, kept up the customs of the dynasty. She remembered her marriage and her years in Dusseldorf with her husband, the Elector, who had loved her and whom she had loved. She remembered the long task of collecting with him, the paintings that now hung in some of the rooms of the palace where she was now dying. She remembered the journey home to Florence after his death, through the cities of Germany and France that the European wars of those years had made dangerous. She remembered the negotiations over the Patto di Famiglia, the long, careful conversations with the lawyers and the diplomats of the new Lorraine dynasty, the moment of signing the document that would, after her death, secure for the public benefit everything the family had spent 3 centuries acquiring. She did not, on the whole, talk about these things in her last days. She had been, like her ancestors, a quiet woman. The pattern of the unsaid in the Medici household had been the family's deepest habit since the founder Giovanni de Medici had lived his careful, quiet life in his modest house at the end of the 14th century. She inherited the habit. She practiced it. She died on the 18th of February 1743 with the dignity that the position required, and she took with her into her grave the small private memories of 3 centuries of family history, of which only the ones the formal records had managed to preserve would in due course be available to the historians who would, much later, try to reconstruct what the family had been. The light came up over the Pitti Palace on the morning after her death, the way the light had come up over the Palazzo Medici on the morning we began with, in the summer of 1469. It came slowly, it came patiently, it came with the particular warmth of the Tuscan dawn that had been falling on the same hills, on the same buildings, on the same streets, since long before the Medici, and that would continue to fall on them long after they were gone. The kitchen woman of 1469 had laid her fire before the light came up, and the light when it arrived had found her at her work, in a building she did not own, in a city whose larger affairs she did not direct, in a household whose decisions she had no part in making. She had done her work and gone home, and 100 women like her had taken her place in the same kitchen across the generations, and the building had passed from the family to the city, to the new dynasty, to the Italian state, to the modern republic, and the light had continued to come up, every morning, over the same building, with the same slow, patient regularity that had characterized it since long before any of the people who had lived in it could remember. The old woman in the Pitti Palace, dying in the early morning of February 1743, had left, by the act of her signature 6 years earlier, the entire accumulated culture of her family to the city. She had not, in some respects, given the city anything that had not, in another sense, always belonged to it. The art had been made by Florentine hands. The buildings had been built by Florentine craftsmen. The wealth that had paid for everything had come, originally, from the Florentine wool trade and the Florentine cloth banking trade. The family had been, in some respects, the conduit through which the city's accumulated talent had flowed into the accumulated material culture of 3 centuries. She, by her signature, had simply returned the conduit's contents to the source. The transaction had a particular justice to it, that her own quiet temperament, by the testimony of those who knew her best, had appreciated. That is the long story. From the careful banker of 1400, who set up his small bank in his small house and made the careful arrangements that would let his sons inherit a position of standing in their city, to the architect of power who came back from his year in Venice and resumed without ceremony the work that his enemies had thought they had ended, to the prince in everything but name who held the household's most extraordinary cultural moment together for 23 years, to the popes, the queens, the dukes, the long centuries of formal princely rule in the small but accomplished state, to the old woman, finally, who signed the document that secured what had been built and then went, with the quietness that the family had always kept, into the same chapel in San Lorenzo where her ancestors had been buried for 300 years. The peat smoke of our Highland story is, in this world, the wood smoke of the Tuscan kitchen, which has the same warm, slightly resinous sweetness when the cypress and the olive prunings are burning, and which still rises, on summer mornings, from the chimneys of the houses in the Tuscan hills. The kettle of our framing image is, in this world, the great copper of the Medici kitchen, which is now in the museum of the palace. and which the visitor can walk past with the small, unself-conscious recognition that comes from having read a long story about it. The light over the Bray is dome of the cathedral, which still, on summer mornings, comes up slowly, the way it did in 1469 and in 1743, and the way it does this very morning on the visitor walking through the early streets of the modern city. The story is the same story that all such stories are. A family rose, a family flourished, a family declined, a family ended, and the things the family had done in the time of its rising and its flourishing remained in the city it had ruled, after the family itself had gone. The visitor walks through the rooms today. The visitor sees the paintings. The visitor sees the sculptures. The visitor sees the buildings. The visitor reads, in the small placards beside the major works, the names of the patrons who commissioned them. The names mean less to most modern visitors than they would have meant to a Florentine of the 15th century. The names are now, in the long retrospect of 3 centuries, the names of historical figures rather than of working political and commercial players. But the works remain. The works are what the names produced. The works are still, in the deepest sense, the cities, because the city is where they were made, and the city is where, by the act of one old woman in 1737, they were guaranteed to stay. If you enjoyed tonight's long walk through the slow life of the wealthiest family in Renaissance Florence, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. The Medici story is one of the great long stories of European history, and we have had time tonight to walk only the principal corridors of it. There are smaller corridors, side passages, individual lives that we have only glanced at, and that are, in their own way, as rich as the principal stories. There will be more nights to walk through them. The light, in Florence, is coming up over the rooftops the way it has always come up. The first carts of the morning are arriving at the markets. Somewhere in a kitchen courtyard, in a building that has stood for nearly 600 years, a woman whose name no one will ever know is laying her fire under the great copper kettle. The kettle hisses against the cold water. The fire catches. The smoke rises. The day, slowly, in its patient old way, begins. Sleep well. The fire is lit. The city is waking. The story, in the small, unhurried way of the cities that know how to keep their stories, goes on. Good night.